Have you ever stopped to consider how a man could murder 93 people over the course of 35 years? Yet, never become a household name, never spark national outrage, or fill news headlines, or become the subject of countless documentaries and best-selling books. In the oppressive quiet of a Kentucky homeless shelter in 2012, law enforcement thought they were detaining just another transient on a minor drug charge. A 72-year-old man, frail and unassuming, with time-worn features and a shuffling gait, who went by the name Samuel Little. He looked like any other elderly man cast aside by the world, forgotten, discarded, harmless. What the authorities didn't know, what no one could have possibly fathomed, was that they had just apprehended the most prolific serial killer in American criminal history. Samuel Little did not achieve the morbid fame of Ted Bundy, the terrifying infamy of Jeffrey Dahmer, or the mystique of the Zodiac Killer. He didn't court the cameras or write letters to the press. He didn't leave behind cryptic messages or carve a recognizable signature into his crime scenes. Instead, he moved through the world quietly, like a shadow, methodical, deliberate, and nearly invisible. His crimes spanned for decades in at least 19 states, claiming the lives of at least 93 women. And chillingly, the FBI believes that every single one of his confessions is credible. This is not just the story of a murderer. It is the story of a man who uncovered something horrifyingly true about American society. Samuel Little knew which victims would be forgotten. He knew which women would vanish without urgency or outrage. He knew exactly whose deaths would never make headlines. And for 35 uninterrupted years, he was absolutely right. Samuel McDowell was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, under circumstances already steeped in instability and despair. His mother, Bessie Mae Little, was only 16 years old at the time, reportedly working as a prostitute. It is believed that she gave birth to Samuel while incarcerated, and almost immediately after, abandoned him on a dirt road in the rural backwoods of Georgia. Alone, unclaimed, unwanted, Samuel was eventually taken in by his grandmother, Fannie Mae McDowell, who brought him to Lorain, Ohio, an industrial town, shadowed by steel mills and smoke-choked skies. At 223 East 33rd Street, in a cramped, weathered house between Broadway and Elyria Avenue, Samuel grew up bearing the psychological scars of maternal rejection. The trauma of being discarded like trash embedded itself in his psyche, manifesting into a lifelong war against women, one they never knew they were fighting until it was too late. Even in his earliest years, the signs were there. According to Samuel's own chilling admissions, his darkest urges began at the age of 5. He recalled sitting in kindergarten, watching his teacher absent-mindedly touch her neck, a small, innocent gesture. But for young Samuel, it was a trigger. That moment, he later said, awakened his obsession with strangulation, embedding violent sexual fantasies that would remain with him forever. As he aged, his behavior became more erratic, more aggressive, and increasingly devoid of empathy. He became fixated on true crime magazines, absorbing details about killers, methods, and victims, like blueprints for a future he had already decided to pursue. Teachers and administrators at Hawthorne Junior High in Lorain struggled to manage him. He was disruptive, violent, unpredictable. In 1954, at just 14 years old, Samuel was sent to the Boys Industrial School in Lancaster, Ohio, after he was caught stealing a bicycle. What was meant to be a reformative stint turned into a training ground for his eventual descent. Over a year and a half, Samuel racked up 47 disciplinary violations. The very institutions tasked with correcting him only seemed to sharpen his capacity for manipulation and violence. By the late 1950s, Samuel had dropped out of high school and vanished from Ohio. What followed was a life of drifting, staying just long enough in each place to blend in, never long enough to attract notice. He supported himself through theft, shoplifting, burglary, and petty crime. Arrested more than 24 times across 11 different states, Samuel always seemed to escape conviction, slipping through the cracks of a system that never saw the full picture. During his many incarcerations, Samuel took up boxing. He was good at it. The structure, the power, the controlled violence appealed to something primal inside him. He referred to himself as a prize fighter, though he never went pro. What mattered more was the way boxing trained him. How to wait, how to strike precisely, and how to hide true intent until the final moment. In the early 1970s, while America reeled from war, cultural shifts, and racial upheaval, Samuel Little began to kill. His first confirmed murder was in 1970, though he claimed the actual number started even earlier. What set Samuel apart from other serial killers wasn't just the volume of his crimes, it was the method. He didn't use guns, he didn't stab his victims, he didn't leave fingerprints or DNA, he strangled them, slowly, methodically, with his bare hands. He relished it. It was intimate, it was personal, it left almost no trace. His victims were carefully chosen, women of color, drug users, sex workers, the mentally ill, the homeless, women already marginalized by a society that had long since stopped caring. Samuel had learned early in life that when people like these disappeared, no one came looking. His killing fields were the forgotten places of America, the back alleys of Los Angeles, the red light districts of Miami, the industrial decay of Cleveland, the desolate highways of Texas. Samuel had an instinctive understanding of how to disappear and how to find women whose disappearances would be written off as overdoses, accidents, or simply another loss in a broken system. He was a hunter, and America, with all its blind spots and bureaucratic failings, was the perfect hunting ground. He lured his victims with promises of drugs, money, or companionship. He was disarming when he needed to be polite, even charming. He'd earn their trust, drive them to isolated areas, and then the killing would begin, slowly, deliberately. He allowed his victims to slip in and out of consciousness, prolonging their fear while maximizing his control. The terror was part of the ritual. The fear, the helplessness, that was what he craved. Afterward, he discarded their bodies like garbage, dumped them in alleys, vacant lots, culverts, ravines, wherever he thought they'd be ignored. In many cases, he was right. Medical examiners misclassified the deaths. Law enforcement chalked them up to overdoses or accidents. There was no weapon, no DNA, no consistent jurisdiction, and so he killed again, and again, and again. In July 1987, Samuel murdered Carol Alford in Los Angeles. Her body was found discarded in an alley, partially nude. In September 1989, he claimed Guadalupe Apodaca, leaving her in an abandoned auto repair shop. Later that same year, he killed Audrey Nelson Everett, her body left to rot in the unforgiving California heat. These murders, Carel, Guadalupe, Audrey, would eventually become key in unraveling Samuel's dark legacy. But it would take more than 2 decades for the truth to surface. He continued through the 1990s. In Cleveland, he strangled Mary Jo Payton and threw her down a basement staircase like discarded furniture. In Tupelo, Mississippi, he claimed Nancy Carol Stevens, a woman he said was his final kill, in August 2005. By then, he had murdered across decades. His crimes spread like a virus, unnoticed and unchecked. And all the while, law enforcement agencies remained siloed. There was no centralized database to link the cases. No one saw the pattern because no one was looking for it. Until in a routine arrest for drug possession at a Kentucky homeless shelter, authorities unknowingly stumbled across a monster. Samuel Little, now 72, was extradited to Los Angeles for the outstanding warrant. As part of the intake process, the LAPD ran his DNA through CODIS. What came back shocked everyone. His DNA matched evidence from 3 cold cases in Los Angeles: Carol Alford, Guadalupe Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson Everett. In 2014, Samuel Little was convicted of all 3 murders. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He sat in court, stoic, indifferent, claiming innocence, but the evidence was incontrovertible. And then, in 2018, something even more chilling happened. Texas Ranger James Holland visited Samuel in prison, seeking information about the 1994 murder of Denise Brothers in Odessa, Texas. What he got was a cascade of horror. Samuel didn't just confess to that murder. He confessed to 92 more. Each confession was detailed, disturbingly accurate, and laced with precision. He remembered what his victims were wearing, where they lived, how they smelled, where he left their body. He even drew their faces portraits so precise that they helped investigators identify women who had been missing for decades. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program launched one of the largest multi-jurisdictional investigations in U.S. history. Confession after confession matched cold case evidence. Time and again, Samuel had described bodies, locations, and circumstances that had never been made public. As of now, the FBI has verified at least 60 of his 93 confessed murders as definitively credible. The remaining cases are still under review. Samuel Little has become the deadliest known serial killer in American history. But the most disturbing element? He was right. No one had been accounting for his victims. Not for decades. And this is where the story continues. Some of the women Samuel Little murdered were never thoroughly investigated. Others, prostitutes, addicts, chronically homeless, were categorized as occupational hazards. Their disappearances rarely scrutinized. Samuel understood this institutional neglect instinctively. He leveraged these prejudices with calculated, cruel intention. Time after time, his victims were failed by nearly every system that should have protected them. Overwhelmed police departments, coroners hesitant to perform thorough examinations, families begging for answers, only to be met with indifference. Samuel Little's decades-long stealth was enabled by society's refusal to care. By the time investigators began matching his confessions to cold cases, a painful truth had emerged. Thousands of red flags had been ignored, and countless lives erased. Finally, more families began to receive answers. Patricia Parkera, a 30-year-old mother from Chattanooga, Tennessee, had been found dead beside a Georgia freeway in 1981. Her body lay undiscovered for days, left in plain sight while authorities looked elsewhere. Her family searched fruitlessly for nearly 40 years. It was not until 2019 that they learned, through connection to Samuel Little's confession, that he had killed her. Details of the murder, her clothing, her route, the location matched precisely. Another chilling case involved a young woman known only as Von Plez, identified in 2023 as Samuel's earliest confirmed victim. She had been murdered in Monroe, Georgia, in 1977 at just 20 years old. For 46 years, she remained a Jane Doe until investigators recognized her in one of Samuel Estron's sketches and confirmed through DNA. She had literally been lost to the system until little less posthumous confessions brought her name back into the light. But for every woman identified, dozens remained nameless. Samuel himself drew portraits of women. He remembered the shape of their faces, hairlines, distinctive facial features, and these sketches, released by the FBI, represent women whose identities remain unknown. Each image functions as a haunting symbol, not just of a lost life, but of society's failure to remember those who seemed invisible. During his final years confined to a wheelchair in a California prison medical unit, the once obscure drifter began eagerly assisting investigators. With unnerving precision, he recounted details of his crimes. He mapped routes where he'd dumped bodies, revealed burial sites, provided victims' names in some cases, and sketched faces in others. He appeared to savor the attention finally acknowledged after decades of disappearing into obscurity. The press dubbed it Little's confession era, a horizon when the silent killer became the core of investigative focus. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little died in custody at age 80. While most men of that age might be mourned or his death was met quietly, without headlines, without protests, without mass media attention. The man who had murdered at least 93 women slipped away in the same relative anonymity that had shielded him for so long. But the legacy of Samuel Little endures not merely as the 93 lives he took, but as an indictment of systemic failures, the prejudices, inertia, and blindness that allowed him to kill for over 3 decades without accountability. His victims were marginalized women whose worth was devalued by society. Their silencing reflects a disturbing truth. In America, some lives are seen as less deserving of justice. Investigators continue to work tirelessly, comparing the 60-plus confirmed confessions with unsolved homicides across multiple states. The FBI maintains a comprehensive online archive dedicated to Little's Kaisa repository of confessions, sketches, timelines, and possible additional victims. Families across the country still hold on to the faint hope that one of the unidentified portraits will correspond to a missing loved one. Each unanswered sketch represents both tragedy and the persistent quest for closure. Samuel Little's story is an uncomfortable reminder. Evil does not always seek recognition. Sometimes it thrives in obscurity, patient and calculating, targeting those whom nobody notices are gone. He understood exactly whose absences would never raise alarm and operated accordingly. For 35 years, he moved through America, unhurried. Then, as his story crescendos toward a broader unraveling, another killer was beginning to emerge from the margins. Have you ever wondered how a man could douse 2 women in gasoline, ignite them, and then, just days later, murder 2 more with cold precision? Under the hum of suburban Christmas lights and the bustle of holiday shoppers, someone was committing atrocities in rural Florida small towns. The weekend of December 7th to 13th, 2007, marked the brief but brutal killing spree of Leon Davis Jr., a man as ordinary in appearance as he was horrifying beneath the surface. Leon Davis Jr. had grown up in Lake Wales, Florida modest hometown, surrounded by citrus groves and marshland, where high school basketball fame was the pinnacle of small-town success. Born on December 14, 1977, Leon matured into a towering 6'5" figure, remembered by classmates as athletic, quick with a joke, and forever tagged as a former basketball star with a friendly demeanor. He listened to country music, skillfully maneuvered an ATV on swampland roads, and seemed, on the surface, like a man whose ambitions just hadn't quite matched his early athletic promise. Yet beneath the charm lay something colder and anger simmering beneath the surface. While many teens outgrew arguments and separated grievances, Leon's anger carried a terrifying intensity. Eyewitnesses recalled how he fought often, and not out of petty teenage rebellion but with calculated force. By adulthood, he slipped between jobs, drifting, never ambitious, but with days punctuated by moments of rage so sudden they unnerved people who knew him. A beauty shop verbal altercation, a bar dispute. Leon refused to back down. His eyes, they said, turned cold in those moments. He married his girlfriend Victoria in 2006, and the couple moved into a home that left them $196,000 in debt, a staggering sum that Leon could not pay on inconsistent labor wages. By winter 2007, the pressure mounted. Victoria was pregnant and had been placed on medical leave. Leon lost his full-time job at Eagle Lake, and bills were piling up. That desperation, that sense of powerlessness, seemed to awaken the predator within him. On December 7, 2007, Leon crossed a threshold. Under neon gas station lights at ABP near Interstate 4, he approached the Indian immigrant employees, Bravinkar Patel, aged 33, and his father, aged 55, changing the station's marquee letters. Surveillance cameras captured Leon's approach, but not his final movements. When the moment turned, Leon brandished a handgun and demanded money. But instead of simply robbing them, he executed both men with precision, a close-range shot to the head each. Their bodies fell silent on the pavement, their lives extinguished in a denied robbery. Leon didn't take a cent. It wasn't about the money, it was about asserting control amid a life spiraling out of his grasp. In the aftermath, Leon drove away calmly, leaving behind two families shattered beneath the glare of security lights. Police had no reliable leads. Leon's face was obscured on video. No witnesses named him. For 6 days, he maintained his fucked-apparent husband, struggling worker returning home, playing with his son, acting like nothing had happened. His violence, however, was not satisfied with a single act. On December 13, 2007, Leon struck again, this time inside the Headley County Nationwide Insurance Office in Lake Wales. Two young women worked there. 26-year-old Yvonne, the office manager, and her colleague. Leon had previously visited the office as a client. On this day, he returned. When building access seemed routine and conversation stayed civil and friendly, the attack came without warning. The office door closed behind them. The violence began swiftly. Brutal Yvonne and her coworker were overpowered, assaulted. The details still sealed under court records describe a violence that seemed calculated and resolute. Then Leon walked out, like someone exiting a meeting.com, as though he'd simply finished an errand. When police discovered the scene, they found nothing to connect the murders to the gas station shooting. The killings felt unrelated. Different victims, different motive, different method. Lake Wales was small. These murders shook the community too. Its core, but detectives sought two isolated tragedies, not the opening salvo of a spree. Authorities called in regional task forces. Profilers were consulted, but early investigations fell short. Leon's pattern remained hidden beneath deception. The killings shared no discernible signature except cruelty and suddenness. The connection, when it came, would be slow. In the ensuing weeks, investigators across Polk County would expand their inquiries. Detectives studied Leon's known history, his movements, credit card records, home surveillance, and social media awareness of his escalating financial desperation, marital stress, and history of violence became pieces in a dark mosaic. But as the story unravels and law enforcement draws closer, this narrative remains unfinished. Leon Davis Jr.'s capture has not yet been revealed here. The community continues to tremble in the aftermath of that December week. Families search for explanations. FBI agents flag similar killings, murders that match Leon's timing, geography, and brutality in other Central Florida counties. Is Leon responsible for more than the known 5 victims? Did he escalate beyond Lake Wales? Did he vanish afterward door? Did he re-enter the shadows, waiting again for the right moment? These questions remain unanswered. The story open, ready for its next chapter. The day her life ended, 23-year-old Juanita Jane Luke, who was 5.5 months pregnant with a son she planned to name Michael, walked into the insurance office full of hope and warmth, bright and caring. Juanita had been sharing her journey to motherhood with friends and co-workers, her smile lighting up every room she entered. On that December afternoon, she and Yvonne Bamonte, the office manager, had no reason to suspect the horror waiting for them. Meanwhile, Leon Davis Jr., an unremarkable man known in Lake Wales for his easy smile and height, standing at 6 feet 5 inches, arrived in his car carrying more than paperwork. He had driven with chilling purpose, bringing along a .357 caliber handgun, DUCT tape, a can of gasoline, a lighter, and bottled premeditation. This wasn't a crime of impulse. This was a meticulously orchestrated act. Inside the Nationwide Insurance Office, Leon shifted from cordial to predatory in an instant. He brandished his gun, herding Yvonne and Juanita into the small back room. He demanded the safe be opened, which held approximately $900 in cash. When the women refused, Leon used duct tape to bind their wrists and ankles, forcing them to their chairs. Both begged for mercy. In particular, pleaded that killing would also kill her unborn child. But Leon had surrendered his last shred of empathy. With deliberate.com/Leon doused both women in gasoline, saturating their hair and clothes. The pungent odor filled the air. As they realized what was coming, Ivana and Juanita screamed in terror. Leon lit the lighter. Flames consumed him within seconds. The bonds burned away, and in agonized panic, both women staggered outside, their clothes and skin aflame. Leon rifled the cash register and took the $900, his ostensible reason for the assault realized. As Juanita ran for help, Leon shot her in the hand. Cruel reinforcement of Contro then calmly got into his car and drove off, leaving 2 women to burn. Both victims were rushed to the burns unit. Despite maximal medical efforts, Ivan succumbed to her injuries on December 18th, 5 days after the attack. Juanita endured until January 8th, when complications claimed her life, and little Michael, delivered prematurely by emergency C-section, died 3 days later. Both victims had tried to survive. Ivan made sure to identify Leon before dying, offering victims' families a crucial clue that eventually led authorities to him. Local TV stations aired Leon's image. Shock turned to dread as the pictures circulated. On December 14th, 2007, Leon turned 30. That same day, rather than flee, he walked into a police station and surrendered. No frantic confession, just a man stepping forward into custody. Some speculated remorse. Others close to him suspected he craved infamy. Finally, people knew his name. Leon answered police questions with emotionless clarity. When forensics connected his weapon to the earlier gas station murders of Pravankar Patel and Dashrath Patel, he admitted to those killings too. Within 1 week, Leon Davis Jr. had taken 5 lives and trials followed. In 2010, during his first hearing, testimony from a medic confirmed Yvonne identified Leon shortly before her death. Prosecutors portrayed a crime of cold calculation, out of desperation, but of planning and intent. The defense cited childhood abuse, bullying, financial desperation, depression, but the jury saw no justification. Leon remained calm through it all. He was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder for Yvonne, Juanita, and baby McKellen, sentenced to death on April 29, 2011. The jury voted 8-4 in favor of capital punishment. In a separate trial for the Patel murders, Leon waived a jury and let the judge decide. Judge Donald Jacobson convicted and imposed a second death sentence, stressing that Leon's actions were permanent proof of his danger to society. Throughout both trials, Leon showed no remorse. He sat impassive as families spoke of grief, loss, and shattered lives. He offered no apology, no empathy, no acknowledgement of pain. To him, the lives he destroyed were obstacles, mere obstructions on a path to a quick payout. The community reeled from what became known as Lake Wales's worst killing spree. A man who, in days, killed 5 innocent people for $900, random victims with no connection to him. A mother, a businesswoman, 2 immigrants, building a new life in America, and an unborn child. Their stories demanded remembrance. In 2016, Leon appealed. The Florida Supreme Court unanimously upheld his death sentences, finding no grounds to reduce the sentences. The crimes were calculated, cruel, and showed zero potential for rehabilitation. Leon is currently on death row at Union Correctional Institution. He's largely forgotten by the outside world. Not a household name, no documentaries, no cult of personality. Unlike Bundy or Dahmer, Leon didn't dramatize his crimes. He quietly erased lives. That's his chilling legacy. 5 lives died because Leon Davis Jr. believed $900 was worth destroying them. Pravankar and Dashrath Patel, hardworking immigrants fueling the gas station economy. Yvonne Bamonte, dedicated to her life's work. Juanita Luciano, pregnant mother, excited for a future with her child. The unborn Michael, robbed of life before birth. Their value was no match for Leon's nihilism. This story remains open. Investigators continue exploring whether Leon Davis Jr. killed beyond Lake Wales in December 2007. Patterns in his financial records, travel routes, social media activity, and even his death suggests he may have tried similar crimes elsewhere. Detectives flagged suspicious incidents across central Florida counties. Around that time, missing women, unexplained fires, assault incidents later ruled accidental. Many remain unexplained. Law enforcement agencies, both local and federal, are reopening cold cases that resemble Leon's method entry into offices or homes under pretense. Fires, strangulation, gasoline, sudden escape. Disturbingly few were linked previously. Across counties, Oak Highlands missing persons and undetermined homicides from late 2007 now raise questions. There are unanswered questions. Did Leon learn to burn after the insurance office attack? Had he tried before? Did he practice? Did he experiment elsewhere and walk away unconnected? Did early flirtations with violent petty thefts Angry altercations, childhood rage fertilized darker ambitions, slowly morphing into horror. The timeline hints at possible other victims earlier in 2007. One suspicious case involved a fire-started death in a Bellevue convenience store in August. Witnesses described a tall man asking for bottles of gasoline, then later a fire and collapsed. Victim found hours later. Security footage blurred his features. Police filed it as accidental. Now, investigators review it. The full record is unfinished. Leon Davis Jr. is captured did not end the story it opened. New chapters in an investigation still unraveling. It's possible more victims remain undiscovered. Connection missing. It's possible Leon's shell of normalcy protected him longer than anticipated. It wasn't anything too obvious, nothing that would raise suspicion at first glance. But everything began to shift for Dean. When his father walked out on the family, Dean was just 7 years old when his dad abandoned them, leaving his mother alone to raise two sons. That same year, Dean received a diagnosis that would change his life. Rheumatic fever? The illness prevented him from joining in on the energetic games and sports his peers enjoyed. While other boys chased each other across playgrounds, Dean sat still watching. He was silent, careful, and learning in ways no one noticed. What began as quiet detachment would later evolve into something far more chilling. His mother, Mary Robinson, eventually remarried and launched a small candy business called Peace and Prince, operating it out of the family's garage sometime in the mid-1950s. For Dean, this was a turning point. He had finally found a place where he felt useful, a role that gave him purpose. Working beside his younger brother, he helped run the machines that made the sweets, and he was good at IP. It was the first time he felt like he truly belonged. When customers stopped by the small shop, Dean would hand out candy samples to their children. He observed their reactions closely, their delight lighting up their faces. But Dean wasn't just enjoying their smiles. He was learning. He began to understand the power of sweetness, not just the sugar itself, but what it could do, how it could attract, how it could manipulate, how it could control. These lessons would stay with him long after the candy stopped being his focus. By the time Dean reached adulthood, he appeared to be just another ordinary man. He had served a brief stint in the U.S. Army during the mid-1960s, a time during which he began to come to terms with his homosexuality. After leaving the military, he returned to Houston and took a job as an electrician at Houston Lighting and Power. His life seemed quiet, routine. He lived alone, moving between modest homes and apartments scattered throughout the Heights neighborhood. To the people around him, Dean was polite but distant, the kind of man who would nod or wave hello, but never invite conversation. He was the sort of person who faded into the background, unnoticed. That ability to go unseen would later become one of his most dangerous traits. What no one knew was that, by 1970, Dean Corll was harboring dark, obsessive fantasies. The innocent joy he once experienced watching children savor sweets had morphed into something grotesque. His attraction to young boys had become twisted, more violent, more consuming. He didn't just desire them, he wanted to dominate them, to control every part of their being. And when that control led inevitably to their death, he wanted to be there to witness the end. The first life Dean took was that of Jeffrey Conan, an 18-year-old college student from the University of Texas. In September 1970, Conan made a fatal mistake. He accepted a ride from Corll while hitchhiking. After that, he was never seen again. He vanished into the heat of Houston as though he'd never existed. His family reported him missing, but in a time when young people often dropped off the grid, roaming freely and experimenting with alternative lifestyles. The police labeled his disappearance as just another runaway case. Jeffrey Conan became just one more name on a growing list of missing persons. But Dean Corll wasn't working alone. The scope of his actions was far too vast, too complex, for one man to handle. He needed assistance, and he found it in the most insidious way possible by enlisting children themselves to help him carry out his crimes. The first of these was David Owen Brooks. Corll had met Brooks back in 1967, when the boy was only 12 years old. Dean nurtured their relationship with patience, carefully positioning himself as a mentor, a surrogate father, someone who seemed to understand the boy better than his own family did. He lavished Brooks with attention, gifts, and outings, slowly grooming him. Over the course of several years, Corll introduced the boy to a world no child should ever see. By the time Brooks turned 14, Corll began paying him for sexual favors. It was a slow, calculated descent step, pulling the boy deeper into Dean's twisted world. Brooks became entangled in a web of shame, dependency, and fear. By the time Corll escalated from abuse to murder, Brooks was already too compromised to turn back. He was trapped. Corll began offering him cash for every boy he could lure, and Brooks, whether out of fear, greed, or a warped sense of loyalty, started helping. The second accomplice came later. Elmer Wayne Henley entered Corll's life in 1971. Henley was 15, and like Brooks, He came from a fractured home, a place filled with instability and hardship. Coral saw in him a familiar vulnerability, but Henley was tougher, more street smart than Brooks. Still, beneath that exterior, he was just a kid eager for attention, desperate for someone to believe in him. Coral exploited that desperation masterfully. He offered Henley a combination of companionship, money, and gradual exposure to his depravity. Slowly, methodically, he pulled Henley into his orbit, teaching him how to help with the killings. Dean Coral's system was horrifying in its efficiency. His teenage accomplices would scout for victims, mostly boys from the Heights neighborhood. They targeted runaways, troubled kids, or teens whose disappearances wouldn't be met with urgency by law enforcement. Once selected, the victims were lured to one of Coral's residences. Coral's method for bringing boys to his various residences relied on simple, believable promises. There would be talk of parties, drugs, a place to crash, anything that might appeal to teenagers, weary of home life, or school pressures. These weren't random abductions on the street. They were calculated lures, tailored invitations to vulnerable youths seeking escape. Once the victims crossed the threshold of Coral's home, the reality they faced was far from what they'd been promised. Many were drugged, sometimes unknowingly, their drinks laced with sedatives. Others were physically overpowered by Coral himself, or with the assistance of Brooks or Henley. What followed was a descent into a nightmare that defies understanding. Inside Coral's home was a chilling centerpiece, a plywood torture board he had specially constructed. The board had handcuffs and restraints affixed to it, designed to immobilize victims while keeping them alive. Coral used it to prolong the suffering, subjecting boys to repeated assaults and tortures that are difficult to even describe. He employed crude tools of agony, spiked dildo among them deliberately crafted to cause excruciating pain. Sometimes, he would play audio recordings of other boys' screams, recordings made during previous tortures. He didn't just derive pleasure from the suffering, he weaponized fear itself. By forcing current victims to hear the anguish of those who came before them, Coral ensured their terror was complete. His aim wasn't just domination, it was psychological obliteration. The final act was almost always murder, carried out either by strangulation or a shot from his .22 caliber pistol. Coral seemed to savor the process, often demanding that his young accomplices not only witness the killings, but actively participate in them. It was a tactic as much about control as it was about cruelty. By making them complicit, he bound them to his secret, trapped them in guilt so deep that silence became their only option. After the victims were dead, Coral and his helpers would wrap the bodies in plastic and dispose of them with a cold efficiency. Most were buried in a rented storage unit used for boats, located in southwest Houston. Beneath its dirt floor, Coral and the boys dug makeshift graves, stacking the corpses like lumber and covering them with lime to speed up decomposition. It was as though the victims weren't people, just objects to be hidden and forgotten. Between 1970 and 1973, a wave of disappearances swept through the Heights neighborhood. At least 28 young males vanished, aged between 13 and 20. They were sons, brothers, friends, some were students, others were many had troubled upbringings, fractured homes, or histories of running away. But despite their differences, they had one thing in common. Society was quick to overlook them. The police often treated missing teenager reports with skepticism. Law enforcement, overwhelmed by crime spikes and shaped by the era's prejudices, routinely categorized these disappearances as runaways. Officers told worried parents to wait it out, that their sons would return once they cooled off. There was little urgency, even less empathy. In many cases, parents were brushed aside, told not to waste police time with what seemed like another case of teenage rebellion. It was this systemic indifference that allowed Coral to flourish. The institutions that should have protected these boys failed them. Coral refined his methods, perfected his manipulation, and continued a spree of horror unchecked for 3 full years. He was confident, untouchable, and for a time, he was right. But like all predators, Coral eventually made a mistake. August 8, 1973, marked the end of his monstrous reign. That night, he invited several teenagers to his home on Lamar Street in Pasadena. Among them was Elmer Wayne Henley, now deeply entrenched in Coral's world, and 2 other youths, a boy and a girl. As the evening wore on, something changed. Coral, emboldened or unraveling, made a chilling declaration. He told them he intended to kill all 3 of them before the night was over. In that moment, something inside Henley shifted. Perhaps it was self-preservation. He realized he was no longer an accomplice, but a target. Maybe it was a surge of guilt, or a realization that the line he had walked so many times had finally vanished beneath his feet. Whatever the reason, Henley acted. As Coral turned his back, Henley seized a .22 caliber pistol and fired. He shot Coral 6 times, ending his life instantly. When police arrived, they found Henley standing over Coral's lifeless body. The scene was surreal, but what Henley said next would shock the entire city on soon. The nation? He didn't just confess to killing Coral. He revealed that Coral had been behind the disappearances of dozens of boys, and he knew where the bodies were buried. In the days that followed, as the Texas summer blazed on and temperatures climbed above 100 degrees, Henley led authorities to the first of the burial sites. Alongside Brooks, he guided them to the rented boat storage shed. What they unearthed was a vision of hell. 17 bodies were recovered from beneath the dirt floor. Some were naked, others wrapped in plastic. All bore signs of the same brutal pattern: torture, sexual abuse, and finally, death. The air was thick with decay. The stench of lime, rot, and despair clung to everything. Investigators found more than both as they uncovered the instruments of Coral's crimes. Electrical wires fitted with alligator clips, likely used for torture. Handcuffs, tape, ropes, and scattered among the remains. Personal items, wallets, shoes, belts that offered painful glimpses into the lives that had been lost. Further searches led investigators to 2 more locations. The first was High Island Beach, where 7 more bodies were found buried in the sand. The second was near Lake Sam Rayburn, where 4 more victims were discovered. Each new grave unearthed brought with it fresh horrors, new evidence of Coral's precise, methodical evil. With every recovery, the story grew more unfathomable. How had no one noticed? How had a man been able to kill so many with such consistency for so long? The answer lay partly in the times. Coral's victims fit a profile society had learned to ignore. Many were labeled troublemakers, delinquents, or the very traits that made them vulnerable to Coral also made them invisible to the authorities. Their disappearances didn't spark outrage or headlines. They sparked silence. The case, now known as the Houston mass murders, became the worst series of serial killings in American history at the time. A total of 28 victims were officially confirmed, though many involved in the investigation believed the true number was likely higher. Coral had been meticulous, and it was entirely possible that more graves remained undiscovered. The youngest known victim was just 13 years old. The oldest was 20. Among them were boys with dreams: musicians, students, brothers, sons. Their deaths weren't just acts of murder. They were erasures of futures, obliterations of identities. Entire families were left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. The public reaction was a mixture of disbelief and rage. How could such atrocities have taken place in plain sight? How could children have been used to lure other children to their deaths? The complicity of Brooks and Henley added layers of complexity and moral ambiguity to the story. Were they victims themselves? Were they monsters in training? Or simply kids swallowed by a predator's manipulation? As the investigation deepened, so did the country's reckoning with its own failures. Coral didn't just expose the cracks in society, he exploited them to devastating effect. There were students and dropouts, misfits and honor roll teenagers, some with dreams of college, others already lost to the streets. But all of them, regardless of background, met the same terrible fate. They crossed paths with Dean Coral. Their lives, diverse and distinct, were each extinguished by a man whose evil lay hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. In the aftermath, the devastation rippled far beyond the victims themselves. Families that had once clung to hope were confronted with unimaginable truths. Sons they believed had run away or gotten lost in the turbulence of adolescence had, in fact, been brutalized and murdered. The illusion that they might still be alive, out there somewhere, collapsed in an instant. Mothers and fathers who had been dismissed by police were now plunged into a horror that defied understanding. The city of Houston reeled from the revelations. Law enforcement, particularly the Houston Police Department, faced a firestorm of criticism for its handling of the missing persons cases. For years, officers had told grieving families to be patient, to stop worrying, to accept the likelihood that their children were just rebellious teens off on some impulsive adventure. That assumption that these boys were not truly in danger had cost lives, dozens of them. The public began to question everything. How had a killer operated in their midst, in the heart of one of America's largest cities, for nearly 3 years without detection? How had no one noticed the disappearances, the patterns, the signs? And how had a man like Coral, seemingly mild-mannered and friendly, created a killing machine with such brutal efficiency? The social systems that had failed the victims also came under intense scrutiny. Community support programs, child protection services, and the broader infrastructure designed to safeguard vulnerable youth were found woefully lacking. Many of Coral's victims had already been failed by the world around them, estranged from their families, living in poverty, or labeled as troublemakers long before they vanished. They were the boys no one looked for, the names no one remembered until it was too late. In the trials that followed, Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks faced justice, though the court of public opinion struggled to determine whether they were monsters in their own right or tragic products of Coral's twisted manipulation. Henley, who had ultimately turned on Coral and shot him dead during what was intended to be another night of torture and murder, was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. His testimony was graphic and harrowing, revealing a mind scarred by exposure to relentless violence and moral corrosion. Brooks, more passive in demeanor, but deeply complicit, was convicted of 1 murder and also sentenced to life in prison. In court, he showed little emotion, offering only vague admissions of guilt and remorse. Neither man ever walked free again, yet their roles in the killings were not easily defined. Both were teenagers when their involvement began. Both were seduced not only by Coral's financial incentives, but also by his calculated grooming emotional manipulation that preyed on their insecurities and isolation. Their stories raised troubling questions about coercion, about responsibility, and about the terrifying ease with which a child can be transformed into a killer. As the dust settled, the reality of the Houston mass murders began to take shape. 28 victims were eventually linked to Coral. Of those, 27 were positively identified. The final boy, found buried among the others, remains nameless, known only as John Doe, 1973. He was wearing swim trunks and a t-shirt emblazoned with a peace symbol, a symbol of a generation seeking love, freedom, and meaning. The irony was cruel. This young man, full of youthful hope, had been lured into a trap and silenced forever. His identity remains a mystery to this day. Forensic scientists, genealogists, and amateur sleuths have spent decades trying to uncover his name, to connect him to a family still searching for answers. But so far, he remains the forgotten son of an era soaked in optimism and rebellion, a face without a name. The story of Dean Coral forces us to examine the very fabric of human nature and society itself. It's a case that challenges our understanding of evil not as something foreign or distant, but as something that can exist within our communities, hiding in plain sight. Coral wasn't a deranged drifter or a violent loner. He was a man who ran a business, handed out candy, smiled at neighbors, and moved through life unnoticed. What turned him into a killer? Was it the rheumatic fever that stole his childhood, or the abandonment by his father? Was it the repression of his sexuality in a time when being gay meant social exile? Or was the darkness always inside him, waiting for the right moment to erupt? Psychologists and criminologists debate these questions endlessly, but the answer may never be clear. Perhaps the most terrifying element of the case is not just what Coral did, but how easily he did it. He operated with near total impunity, abducting and murdering children in broad daylight, sometimes mere blocks from their homes. He turned children into accomplices, manipulating their need for approval, belonging, and money. He exploited the indifference of institutions and the blind spots of society. This was not just a failure of law enforcement. It was a collective moral failure, a society that looked away when its children disappeared, that categorized certain lives as less valuable, that dismissed parents' fears as hysteria. And in that silence, Dean Coral thrived. His death brought an end to the killings, but the scars remained. Families never recovered. Communities changed forever, and the haunting knowledge of what had happened, of what had been allowed to happen, lingered like smoke in the air. Today, more than 5 decades after the nightmare was exposed, the case is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. The boys whose lives were stolen are no longer anonymous shadows. They are Houston's lost boys, and their names, faces, and stories have been reclaimed by history. Schools have been renamed in their honor. Documentaries and books continue to explore their stories. And in a small cemetery outside Houston, rows of graves serve as a chilling memorial to innocents destroyed. But the lessons of the Candyman murders resonate far beyond Houston. They speak to every community, every institution, and every parent. They remind us that evil does not always come with a warning. Sometimes, it knocks on the door with a smile and a bag of candy. Coral's crimes shook the foundation of trust that holds communities together. His ability to manipulate not just individuals, but entire systems revealed a gap of failure in our collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable. And while he is long dead, the mechanisms that enabled him to kill social neglect, institutional apathy, and psychological grooming remain very much alive. In remembering the victims, we do more than honor their memory. We affirm the need for vigilance. We declare that no child should be forgotten, that no parent's cry should be ignored, and that no evil should ever be allowed to flourish. Unchecked, the story of Dean Coral is not just a tale of horror. It's a warning, a lesson, and above all, a call to never again look away. Evil within. As the world absorbed the shocking truth, it became painfully clear that D'Angelo hadn't just evaded justice, he had manipulated trust, concealed behind a manufactured image of decency that shielded him from suspicion for decades. Friends, neighbors, Colleagues, even his own wife, and children were stunned by the revelation. To them, Joseph was the man who watered his lawn every Sunday morning, who barbecued in the backyard and waved politely to neighbors as he passed. He was the man who played with his grandchildren, shopped at the local store, and complained about the noise from teenagers down the street. No one had imagined that the face behind that familiarity was the face of the Golden State Killer. D'Angelo's trial became a defining moment not only for his victims and their families, but for the broader justice system. During the sentencing phase, survivors and the families of those murdered were given the opportunity to address the man who had haunted their lives for decades. They spoke with unflinching clarity about the pain, the terror, the sleepless nights, the shattered relationships, and the emotional scars that never healed. One by one, they recounted the moments their lives were altered forever, standing before the man who had stolen their peace. But D'Angelo, now old and frail, remained mostly silent, his head bowed, as though the weight of his past had finally begun to crush him. Still, his silence was not enough to redeem him. No amount of aging or remorse could erase the legacy of horror he had created. These were not the impulsive crimes of a desperate man. They were the careful, calculated acts of a predator who reveled in the suffering he caused. His story, like that of Dean Corll before him, forces us to ask haunting questions about the nature of evil and the cracks in our institutions that allow monsters to go unnoticed for so long. In both cases, the killers were not strangers lurking in shadows, but men who lived among oozmen who used their knowledge of law enforcement, their access to young and vulnerable people, and the trust of their communities to mask the horror of who they really were. In the wake of D'Angelo's conviction, survivors found a measure of closure, though not peace. For many, the trauma lingered. Some had spent the better part of their lives afraid of the dark, checking locks obsessively, jumping at unknown sounds. Others had never spoken publicly about what had happened to them, afraid of disbelief, judgment, or simply being unable to relive the horror. But now, with his name known and his face unmasked, they could begin the long process of healing, though the scars would never fully disappear. The case also inspired a shift in how investigators approach cold cases. The use of genetic genealogy in D'Angelo's arrest marked a turning point in forensic science. No longer were old crimes simply left to gather dust now, with public DNA databases and advanced familial tracing. The past had a new voice. Cold case units across the country began reopening files, hopeful that other monsters who once believed themselves untouchable might finally be caught. The Golden State Killer wasn't just a story of evil, it became a beacon of justice, a reminder that even the most patient predator can't hide forever. In the aftermath of his arrest and trial, D'Angelo was placed in protective custody at California's most secure prison. There, in a concrete cell, far removed from the lives he had ruined, he began what will be the final chapter of his life. His days, once filled with sadistic pleasure and power, were now marked by silence, loneliness, and reflection, or perhaps only the emptiness that comes when a monster is finally caged. But for the survivors and families, their chapters are still unfolding. Some have become advocates for victims' rights, pushing for reforms that ensure cold cases are never again ignored. Others have dedicated their lives to healing, to rebuilding the parts of themselves that D'Angelo tried to destroy. And while justice may have come late, it came with a sense of finality that allowed the truth to breathe. The case of Joseph James D'Angelo will be studied for generations by law enforcement and psychologists alike. His dual life, a man of order by day, a bringer of chaos by night, demonstrated the terrifying potential for deception in human nature. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes, to execute them with surgical precision while maintaining the illusion of normalcy, defied everything we think we know about criminal behavior. And yet, perhaps the most sobering realization is how many people like him might still be out there unremarkable, hiding in plain sight, waiting. His capture may have closed one chapter of American criminal history, but it opened our eyes to the possibility that the monster next door isn't always obvious. That danger doesn't always come with a snarl. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it wears a uniform, sometimes it's just Joe from down the street. Even now, as D'Angelo spends his final years behind bars, the full extent of his crimes remains unknown. Investigators believe there may be more victims of solved burglaries, missing persons, cold cases that fit his patterns. Each one represents a life interrupted, a story that might never be told. But the legacy of his terror also brings with it a legacy of resilience. His victims, those who survived, those who died, and those who fight every day to live beyond his shadow, are the true focus of this story. They remind us that evil can be defeated, that truth can triumph over time, and that even the most monstrous among us can eventually be brought to justice. And so the story continues not only in court records and forensic files, but in every unlocked case file that finds new hope, in every survivor who refuses to be silenced, and in every community that refuses to let fear win. The darkness Joseph James D'Angelo brought to California's quiet suburbs was vast, but in the end, it was not eternal. Light, as it always does, found a way in, and in that light, the victims Houston's lost boys, the women of Sacramento, the families scattered across decades of grief found their voices again. And it wouldn't be long before the hunger returned. Frank Anthony Walls had crossed a line that day on the beach in 19... line that separated disturbed youth from full-fledged predator. But unlike the impulsive killer so often caught by a trail of chaos, Frank was deliberate. He knew how to wait, how to blend, how to disarm suspicion with a blank stare and a soft-spoken voice. He wore the mask of mediocrity, well slipping through the cracks of a justice system that underestimated him, and a community that refused to believe that a killer could be one of their own. By the fall of 1986, that dormant violence began to bubble again beneath the surface. Frank didn't just crave control, he needed it. His crimes evolved, growing more strategic, more terrifying, and more frequent. That October, he struck again, this time targeting a couple living in a mobile home in Fort Walton Beach, just a short drive from his neighborhood. The victims, a young man named Ronnie and his girlfriend Patricia, were ambushed in the dead of night. The attack was swift, brutal, and deeply personal. Frank used a knife again, the same preferred method of control and silence he'd used on the beach. He left almost no evidence behind. Just like with Tommy Lewitton, he disappeared into the shadows of Ocean City without a trace, retreating once more into the comforting camouflage of everyday life. But even the most careful killers slip. In Frank's case, it was arrogance, the sense of invincibility that often follows when someone has gotten away with murder. He began talking more openly about his fantasies with his roommate, Thomas Farr, whose nickname Animal reflected a personality equally unbalanced. Investigators would later learn that their trailer was a breeding ground for shared dark jokes, perverse confessions that should have sounded alarm bells, but were instead drowned out by small-town silence and apathy. Frank continued dating Reba's stepdaughter, spending more time around a man who would eventually confess to several killings of his own. It was as if Frank had found not just partners in depravity, but a social structure that reinforced it, a makeshift brotherhood of predators feeding off one another's darkness. Together, they helped sustain the lie that no evil could possibly be festering within the modest trailers and beat homes of Okaloosa County. In early 1987, Frank committed what would become his most brutal and revealing double homicide that finally exposed the true scope of his violence. He had targeted a young couple in their own home, breaking in during the early hours of the morning. He tied them up, interrogated them, toyed with their fear, and ultimately executed them both with calculated cruelty. This wasn't about impulse anymore. It was about control, domination, a ritual he had honed to perfection. Investigators at the time were overwhelmed. The randomness of the attacks, the lack of forensic evidence, and the seemingly disconnected nature of the crimes made linking them nearly impossible. But what troubled law enforcement most was the chilling realization that the killer didn't appear to have a clear motive. There was no theft, no significant personal connection to the victims. This was murder for murder's sake, the work of someone who killed not out of desperation but out of desire. When Frank was finally arrested in July of 1987, it wasn't because of a crime scene blunder or some heroic act of police brilliance. It was because of gossip. Word had spread around Ocean City, whispers of confessions, stories told in drug-fueled rants, eerie comments made at parties. Someone finally tipped off authorities, and when detectives began piecing together Frank's timeline and associations, the evidence began to align. Not physical evidence, Frank had been too careful for that, but behavioral evidence. Witness accounts, patterns, inconsistencies in alibis, and finally, the testimony of his own roommate. During his interrogation, Frank did not confess in a moment of guilt or remorse. Instead, he spoke with the cold detachment of someone who believed he had outsmarted everyone. He described his victims in clinical terms. He offered no apologies, no justification, just a recounting of events, as though he were describing something mundane, routine like washing dishes at Quincy's. In court, the jury listened in stunned silence as prosecutors detailed Frank's string of murders, his escalating violence, and the shocking lack of any discernible remorse. Survivors from the community packed the courtroom, many of them hearing for the first time that the quiet young man they'd seen at the local diner or passed on the boardwalk had been responsible for some of the most vicious killings in the region's history. He was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. But even with justice served, the residents of Ocean City struggled to reconcile the boy they thought they knew with the monster who had lived in their midst. Frank's crimes didn't just tear families apart, they shattered the illusion that small towns are safe, that evil can be seen coming, that monsters can't smile and wave, Like Joseph D'Angelo, Frank Athane Walsh was not a caricature of horror. He was not a stranger hiding in the woods or a madman howling at the moon. He was something far more disturbing, shaped by neglect, emboldened by silence, and protected by a community unwilling to see the truth, staring them in the face. Their stories run parallel in terrifying ways. Both D'Angelo and Frank were men who understood how to wear masks. They built lives of quiet conformity while hiding urges so dark they defied imagination, and when they struck with precision and detachment. They didn't kill because they were out of control, they killed because they were in control. Every moment of violence was premeditated, ritualistic, purposeful. And just like Frank Walsh reminds us that the greatest threat often comes not from the obvious villain, but from the one who knows how to pass as ordinary. The neighbor, the coworker, the teenager down the street. Frank remains on death row today, his case largely forgotten by the wider public, but still remembered with painful clarity by those who lived through it. His name isn't whispered on documentaries or dissected on podcasts. He's not featured on true crime lists or turned into a household boogeyman. But make no mistake, his crimes were as brutal, his mind is twisted, and his ability to hide in plain sight every bit as chilling as the most infamous serial killers in history. The lesson we take from him and from D'Angelo's that evil doesn't always wear a mask of madness. Sometimes it wears a uniform, sometimes it wears an apron, and sometimes it wears the face of someone you think you know. Trailer taking with him a few personal items and whatever cash she could find, not because he needed the money, but perhaps to stage the scene as a robbery gone wrong. Then he slipped silently back into the night, returning to his trailer as if nothing had happened. By sunrise, the residents of Greenwood Mobile Home Park would awaken to find their quiet neighborhood forever changed by an act of inhuman violence. The discovery of Edward Algar and Ann Louise Peterson as bodies horrified law enforcement and rattled the Ocean City and Wright communities to their core. This wasn't just another brutal killing, it was calculated torture, home invasion, and double homicide all in one. The details, once uncovered, painted a picture of a predator who was growing bolder, more meticulous, and infinitely more dangerous. Frank's ability to remain unnoticed through all of this defied belief. Here was a young man, just 19 years old, moving about freely in the very town where he had taken lives. He went to work. He laughed with acquaintances. He continued dating. To those who didn't look too closely, he was simply another face in the crowd, a dishwasher, a roommate, a boyfriend. But behind that unassuming exterior was a man whose depravity had reached its peak. By this point, police were beginning to piece things together. The sheer brutality of the July double homicide was unlike anything they had encountered in the region, and for the first time, they began to consider the possibility of a serial killer. Investigators started cross-referencing unsolved cases, looking for patterns, reviewing crime scene details with renewed scrutiny. It wasn't long before whispers began to circulate among locals, whispers about Frank Walsh, the quiet but odd teenager who had always seemed a bit off. People started talking about the disturbing things he had said, about his obsession with violence, about his strange behavior following the murders. The turning point came when one of Frank's acquaintances finally stepped forward and reported something he'd said after the murders. That tip, combined with the increasing pressure to find answers, led authorities to bring Frank in for questioning. Initially, he denied everything, but as evidence began to stack up, particularly testimony from his roommate and others, in his social circle, his story began to unravel. Eventually, during a series of interrogations, Frank confessed not out of remorse, but with an eerie, almost academic detachment. He described the killings in chill and detail, showing no emotion as he recounted each crime. He referred to his victims not as people, but as targets, revealing a mindset entirely devoid of empathy or humanity. When asked why he did it, Frank offered no clear motive. He wasn't driven by money, revenge, or even passion. It was control, domination, power, taking lives. For him, was a way to assert complete authority over another human being. Frank's trial was one of the most shocking in Florida's criminal history. The courtroom was filled daily with reporters, grieving families, and a community still trying to understand how such evil had thrived among them. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not only his confessions, but the pattern of behavior, the consistent methods, the timeline that perfectly matched his whereabouts. Witnesses testified about his twisted fantasies, his confessions, his manipulative behavior. The most haunting testimonies came from the forensic experts and investigators who had visited the crime scenes. They spoke of the blood, the signs of torture, the calculated way each scene had been staged. One seasoned detective broke down while describing the scene in Audrey Gigi's trailer, calling it the most disturbing thing he had ever encountered in his career. Frank Walls was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He was sent to Florida State Prison, where he remains on death row to this day. His appeals have been denied repeatedly, and while the wheels of justice continue to turn slowly, for the families of his victims, the nightmare has never truly ended. What makes Frank S. story so terrifying? What continues to haunt those who remember the summer of 1987 isn't just the violence, but the invisibility. He didn't look like a killer. He didn't act like a monster. He wasn't a loner hiding in the woods or a drifter passing through town. He was homegrown. He belonged to the community. He walked the same streets, ate at the same restaurants, smiled at the same neighbors. Just like Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, Frank Walls teaches us that evil can wear a familiar face, that a predator doesn't need to hide in shadows when he has mastered the art of blending into the light. Their crimes, decades apart and on opposite coasts, echo the same sinister truth. Some of the most dangerous individuals are those who have learned how to hide in plain sight, to manipulate trust, to exploit normalcy. The aftermath of Frank's crimes left deep scars on the Okaloosa County community. People began locking their doors. They stopped trusting, so many who knew Frank, teachers, friends, neighbors, were left wondering how they could have missed the signs. In truth, some didn't. There were warnings, red flags, but as so often happens, they were brushed aside, rationalized, ignored. Nobody wanted to believe that a serial killer could be someone they'd shared a table with, someone they'd known for years. For investigators, the Frank Walls case became a blueprint, a disturbing case study in how serial killers evolve, how they mask themselves, and how communities often enable them through silence or disbelief. His name may not be as well known as Bundy or Dahmer, but to those who study criminal psychology, Frank remains a critical figure in understanding how violent minds operate in secrecy. And for the victims' families, the pain is not dulled by time. Their loss isn't a chapter in a book, it's a lifelong sentence. A daily absence, a wound that never fully heals. They carry forward not just the grief, but the knowledge that someone so close, so seemingly ordinary, was capable of such unspeakable acts. Today, Frank Walls waits on death row, aging slowly behind the steel bars of a prison that now holds him accountable. He is no longer invisible. His mask has been stripped away, but the fear he sowed, the pain he caused, and the lesson he left behind, those things remain. They are reminders, carved deep into the heart of a community, that monsters don't always come from elsewhere. Sometimes, they grow right next door. Absolutely nothing as he ended their lives. Each of them had families, friends, and stories that were cut short by a man who saw no more value in their lives than the objects he stole from their homes. The horrifying truth of Frank Walls' crimes is not only the brutality of his methods, but the ease with which he operated in plain, sit unnoticed, undeterred, and unrepentant. After the murders, as investigators delved deeper into Frank's background, they began to construct a profile of a young man who had long been on the edge of darkness. Those who had known Frank during his teenage years described him as quiet, somewhat withdrawn, but never overtly threatening. He wasn't the sort of person anyone would immediately suspect of harboring violent impulses. But there were signs, subtle to some, glaring to others. He had a fascination with knives and often spoke about death in ways that made others uncomfortable. Animals in his neighborhood were reported missing or found mutilated. He peeped through neighbors' windows and stalked women. But these acts were treated as juvenile misbehavior, not as part of a larger, developing pathology. In hindsight, it's easy to ask how his descent into savagery went unnoticed. How did so many warnings go unheeded? The answer lies partly in the system's failure to act, and partly in Frank's own cunning. He wore normalcy like a disguise, mimicking the behaviors and routines of a regular young man. He held down jobs, he had acquaintances, he blended in, and behind closed doors, he plotted his next kill. Frank's ability to manipulate those around him extended even into his relationship with his roommate, Thomas Ann. While Frank's behavior raised Farnham's suspicions, it took the horror of a double murder for him to go to the authorities. Farnham later told reporters that Frank had started to frighten him, talking casually about fantasies involving rape and murder, detailing his dreams of control and suffering. After the deaths of Edward and Anne, Farnham found himself unable to sleep, convinced that Frank might kill again or even turn on him. It was Farnham's statement that brought the police to Frank's doorstep, and once there, they found more than just a troubled young man. They found a killer in possession of stolen property from his victims, physical evidence tying him to multiple scenes, and most damningly, a full and voluntary confession. Frank didn't deny anything. In fact, he seemed eager to talk. He spoke of the murders as though he were describing a scene from a movie, detached, emotionless, even proud. He recalled, in grim detail, how he had broken into Audrey Gigi's trailer, how he had waited in the dark, listening to her breathing, how he had attacked her, tortured her, and then left only to return later, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The way he described returning to the scene to further mutilate her body sent shivers through the room, not out of necessity, not even out of fear of getting caught, but because, in his own words, he wasn't done yet. Frank's trial lasted several weeks, and though the outcome was inevitable, the proceedings revealed more disturbing truths. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence, physical, forensic, and testimonial. But what left the biggest impact were Frank's own words, recorded in confession and replayed in court. He described his crimes as if he were narrating a horror novel, each victim just another chapter in a story he believed was his to write. Psychiatrists who examined Frank were divided in their opinions. Some believed he was mentally ill, suffering from a form of antisocial personality disorder coupled with psych. Others argued that while he lacked empathy, he was fully aware of what he was doing. His acts were deliberate, conscious, and carried out with planning and precision. He knew right from wrong. He simply didn't care. During sentencing, family members of the victims spoke through tears and anger. Parents, siblings, and friends stood before the court and described the holes Frank had torn in their lives. One mother held up a photograph of her daughter, her voice breaking as she described her struggle to explain to her grandchildren why their mother would never come home again. A father said he had spent every day for 2 years wishing it had been him instead of his son. The grief in the courtroom was palpable, like a living, breathing thing that hung over every word. Frank, for his part, remained mostly silent. He offered no apologies, no emotion. He did not look at the families as they spoke. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he simply shook his head. When the sentence was finally read aloud, death for the murder of N. Louise Peterson, life imprisonment for the murder of Edward L., and additional sentences for the murders of Audrey, Tommy Lou, and Cynthia, the courtroom exhaled. Justice, though imperfect, had been served, but justice doesn't bring back the dead. And in Ocean City, that truth continues to linger. The trailer park where Edward and Ann once lived was eventually demolished, replaced by a strip of pavement and wild grass. Locals say it was never quite the same after that summer. The air felt heavier. People spoke in hushed tones when they remembered what had happened there. Parents kept a tighter watch on their children. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. The scars were invisible, but deep. Don Vincent, the investigator who led the team that brought Frank to justice, remained haunted by the case until his death in 2022. He once said that he never again walked into a dark room without thinking of Frank Walls, the man who had hunted in silence, who had taken so much and shown so little. Vincent feared that Frank's story would be forgotten over time, that people would remember only the sensational headlines, not the human tragedy beneath them, but some memories refused to fade. Frank Waltz remains incarcerated at Union Correctional Institution in Ryford, Florida. Now, in his late 50s, he has spent over 3 decades on death row. His lawyers continue to appeal his sentence, arguing that he is intellectually disabled and thus constitutionally protected from execution. But courts have repeatedly denied these claims, citing consistent IQ scores above the threshold and records that show he functioned capably in society, working, planning, manipulating. The appeals drag on, each one reopening old wounds for the families who still wait for closure. His name no longer dominates headlines. His face has aged. His story, however, continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the banality of evil, about the fragility of safety, and about the dangers of underestimating the darkness that can reside behind an ordinary face. Frank Walls wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in some distant alleyway. He was the neighbor, the coworker, the quiet kid down the street, and that's what makes him so terrifying. And still, there is more to uncover. More questions left unanswered. More darkness that has yet to be fully brought to light. Routine would begin. He would drive them to an isolated area, often near wooded trails, rivers, or deserted roads where he felt comfortable and in control. There, after earning their trust with quiet conversation and a gentle demeanor, he would strike. Sometimes, he attacked quickly. Other times, he would wait, allowing a false sense of security to grow before brutally strangling his victims, often with items of their own clothing. It was a method that left little forensic evidence and spoke volumes about his desire for control and domination. After killing, Gary often left the bodies in clusters near the Green River, hidden in thick underbrush or submerged in shallow water. Sometimes, he returned to the sites days later to engage in necrophilic acts with the decomposing, but behavior so grotesque and disturbing, it horrified even the most seasoned investigators. In other cases, he would move the bodies after the fact to confuse police and break up the pattern they were beginning to detect. The killings became so frequent that local authorities formed a special task force, the Green River Task Force, dedicated solely to tracking the murderer. Detectives combed the crime scenes for clues, interviewed hundreds of sex workers, and even brought in criminal profilers and FBI experts. Among them was the legendary profiler John Douglas, who later described Gary Ridgway as the most ordinary killer he had ever studied, someone who defied the dramatic stereotypes of serial murderers. Despite the growing mountain of evidence, Ridgway evaded capture for years. He passed multiple polygraph tests and was even interviewed several times by police. In each case, he remained calm, offering plausible explanations, pretending ignorance, and deflecting suspicion with his quiet demeanor. His ability to remain invisible, even under direct scrutiny, was one of the most chilling aspects of his character. By the early 1990s, the murders had slowed, but they had not stopped. The Green River Killer, as he had come to be known, seemed to disappear, his trail gone cold. But the impact of his crimes lingered. Families of the victims lived in torment, never knowing who had taken their daughters, sisters, or mothers. The community, once marked by its hard-working blue-collar spirit, became known nationally as the hunting ground of a serial predator. Gary Ridgway's luck finally ran out in 2001, nearly 2 decades after his first confirmed kill. Advancements in DNA technology had made it possible to re-examine evidence from the original crime scenes. A small trace of semen found on one of the early victims was tested again, this time matched to Ridgway, whose DNA had been collected years earlier during a routine arrest. When police brought him in for questioning, Ridgway at first denied everything. But as the evidence mounted and it became clear that the game was over, he began to talk. And once he started, he didn't stop. In a series of interviews that spanned months, Ridgway confessed to killing 71 women, though only 49 could be confirmed. He described his methods in chilling detail, walking investigators through each crime, sometimes smiling as he recalled certain murders. He claimed he targeted prostitutes because he thought he could kill as many as he wanted without anyone noticing. They were easy to pick up, he said, and I knew nobody would miss them. Ridgway's confessions led police to the remains of several previously undiscovered victims. For some families, it was the painful closure they had waited decades for. For others, it opened new wounds, confirming that their loved ones had suffered at the hands of a man who viewed them as disposable. In exchange for his full confession and cooperation in locating victims' remains, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. In 2003, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, 49 consecutive life sentences, one for each confirmed victim. He now resides in Washington State Penitentiary, where he spends his days in isolation. To this day, he shows little to no remorse for his actions. In interviews, he has admitted that he doesn't remember all the names or faces of the women he killed. They blur together in his memory, a grotesque collage of suffering and dehumanization. What makes men like Gary Ridgway and Frank Walsh so disturbing isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but how mundane they seemed to the outside world. They didn't wear their evil like a badge. They hid it behind everyday routines, jobs, families, neighbors who waved back and smiled. They were wolves in the softest of sheep's clothing. The terrifying reality is that killers like these often go unnoticed until it's too late. They exploit society's blind spots, its failures to protect the vulnerable, its assumptions about who is dangerous and who is not. Gary Ridgway and Frank Walsh are reminders that evil rarely announces itself. It whispers, it waits, it adapts. In Ocean City, Florida, and in the green shadows of Seattle's outskirts, entire communities were forever altered by the crimes of 2 men who seemed, at a glance, so unremarkable. Parents lost children, children lost parents, and the wounds left behind are not easily healed. Even today, years after their capture, their stories continue to echo. In classrooms, criminal justice programs use their cases as examples. In victim advocacy groups, their crimes fuel efforts to change how missing persons are handled, especially those from marginalized communities. In documentaries and books, their names resurface, not to glorify, but to understand, to remember. The families of the victims still gather. Some light candles, others hold vigils. All try, in their own ways, to reclaim the dignity and memory of those who were taken. They speak not just of the violence that ended lives, but of the beauty that once filled them. They talk about laughter, hobbies, birthdays, and favorite songs. Powerful reminders that their loved ones were more than just statistics in a true crime archive. In one such vigil, a woman stood holding a framed photo of her sister. She had been one of Gary Ridgway's earliest victims. She was more than what he did to her, the woman said. She was love, she was light, and she's still here with me. As the names of the lost were read aloud, Wendy, Audrey, Tommy Lou, Cynthia, and Edward, and so many others, their stories were given back to them. No longer just victims, no longer defined solely by the evil that took them. They became real again. The world may never be able to fully comprehend what drives men like Frank Walsh and Gary Ridgway. Their minds operate in realms most cannot fathom. But what we can do, what we must do, is refuse to forget those they tried to erase. Their victims matter. Their lives mattered. And their stories are not over yet. Gary Ridgway would often drive his victims back to his unassuming residence in a small, modest house nestled in a quiet neighborhood where no one would have imagined the unspeakable horrors taking place within its walls. The house became his private slaughterhouse, a grim sanctuary where control was absolute, and the facade of normalcy fell away to reveal the darkness underneath. Once inside, the terror began. He raped his victims, often repeatedly, with an emotionless detachment that bordered on mechanical. His preferred method of killing was manual strangulation, a technique he would later describe as the most intimate and fulfilling form of murder. In some instances, he used ligatures like ropes, cords, or the victim's own clothing. But his hands, he said, gave him the greatest sense of power. The act of feeling life leave the body under his grip was, in his own chilling words, the only moment I felt truly alive. After their deaths, he would calmly load the corpses into his truck, sometimes wrapping them in tarps, sometimes not, then drive out to one of his carefully selected dumping sites. These locations, mostly remote wooded areas scattered throughout King County, were places he had scouted in advance. They were isolated, difficult to access, and unlikely to be stumbled upon by hikers or hunters. Ridgway chose them not just for their seclusion, but for the sick intimacy they offered, a private world where he could return to his victims long after they were gone. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Gary Ridgway's killings was his necrophilia. He didn't simply leave the bodies to rot, he returned to them, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks, driving into the woods with a disturbing sense of purpose. There, among the damp leaves and trees, he would engage in sexual acts with the decomposing remains. He brought flowers, costume, jewelry, even stuffed animals on occasion, placing them beside the bodies, like romantic offerings. To him, these visits weren't about remorse or remembrance. They were a grotesque continuation of his control, a sick parody of a relationship that only he recognized. The systematic nature of his crimes was terrifying in its precision. Gary treated killing with the same methodical discipline he applied to painting trucks at Kenworth. He left behind almost no physical evidence. At times, he deliberately scattered cigarette butts and gum wrappers from brands he didn't use to mislead investigators. He rotated his dump sites, varied his methods slightly, and never established a consistent pattern, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to develop a clear behavioral profile. Between 1982 and 1984, Ridgway escalated to a staggering pace. More than 40 young women, many of them runaways, sex workers, or otherwise vulnerable, vanished from the Seattle area. Their remains began to appear in clusters, half submerged in the Green River or buried shallowly in wooded areas. The media dubbed the unidentified predator the Green River Killer, and a massive manhunt was launched. The Green River Task Force was formed, one of the largest and most expensive serial killer investigations in U.S. history. Detectives pored over case files, examined forensics, and tracked down leads by the thousands. They knocked on doors, interviewed sex workers, analyzed traffic patterns, and scrutinized every clue they could find. Yet, Ridgway was always just out of reach. He followed the investigation obsessively, reading every article, watching nightly news reports, and adjusting his tactics whenever he sensed law enforcement was getting close. When investigators began to theorize that the killer was familiar with King County's backroads and rural areas, Ridgway started moving his bodies to new, unfamiliar locations. When they suggested that he might have military experience, he intentionally downplayed his time in the Navy. He stayed one step ahead of the task force, not because he was particularly brilliant, but because he was patient, calculating, and utterly without conscience. Perhaps most disturbingly, Ridgway lived a seemingly normal life throughout this entire period. In 1985, he married Judith Moore, a kind-hearted woman who had no inkling of the darkness that resided behind her husband's mild-mannered facade. He was affectionate with her, attended church regularly, and even participated in local volunteer groups like Neighborhood Watch. To neighbors and co-workers, he was just Gary, the truck painter. Quiet, polite, maybe a little reserved, but certainly not someone who would murder dozens of women. Meanwhile, the task force was unraveling. Leads dried up, morale dropped, and the list of suspects grew unwieldy. Gary's name surfaced more than once. He was questioned in 1983 after a witness claimed to have seen 18-year-old Marie Malvar getting into a pickup truck that matched his. Police paid him a visit. Ridgway was calm and cooperative. He denied knowing Marie and even let officers search his home and truck. But what they didn't know was that he had already disposed of Marie's body and burned any evidence that might have linked her to him. Her remains wouldn't be discovered for nearly 20 years. Even Ted Bundy, another infamous serial killer, then on death row, offered his insights to the Green River investigation. Bundy reached out to Detective Dave Reich, suggesting that the killer might be revisiting the bodies to perform post-mortem acts. His theory was disturbingly accurate, but even with this insight, the task force couldn't pin down their suspect. By 1985, the pressure began to mount, and Ridgway, sensing the heat, slowed his pace. He didn't stop, he never truly stopped, but his killings became less frequent. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, he continued to prey on vulnerable women, but the gaps between murders grew longer. He adapted again, growing more cautious, less impulsive. He evolved with the investigation, always staying just beyond its reach. His final confirmed murder occurred in long years after the first body was pulled from the Green River. In that time, Gary Ridgway had murdered at least 49 women, and through it all, he lived as a free man, watching news reports about his own crimes, listening to the families of his victims plead for justice, and going to work every morning like nothing had happened. But time and science finally caught up to him. In the late 1990s, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. Cold cases around the country were being reopened, and samples that had once been useless were now gold mines of information. In 2001, new DNA tests were run on semen samples recovered from several early victims of the Green River Killer. The results were undeniable. Gary Ridgway's genetic signature matched the evidence perfectly. Additionally, microscopic paint particles found on the clothing of Wendy Lee, his first confirmed victim, were traced back to the Kenworth truck plant, his workplace. The forensic puzzle was coming together after nearly 2 decades. On November 30th, 2001, Ridgway was arrested in the parking lot of his job. The man who had haunted the Pacific Northwest for 20 years was finally in custody. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't scream or resist. He simply went quietly, looking more like a confused retiree than one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. Even in custody, Ridgway remained manipulative. He denied involvement at first, feigning confusion and ignorance. But as the evidence was laid out before him, piece by piece, he realized the game was over. Facing the death penalty, he agreed to cooperate in exchange for life imprisonment. What followed was one of the most extensive confessions in modern criminal history. He admitted to 48 murders, though he hinted there may have been more. In graphic, remorseless detail, he led detectives to burial sites, revisited scenes of death, and described his methods. He talked about how he targeted women who were easy, how he chose dump sites close to where he could return later, how he balanced murder and daily life without a second thought. He confessed not because of guilt, but because it gave him the final word control over the narrative, even behind bars. His cooperation spared him the death sentence, and in 2003, Gary Ridgway was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 9 consecutive life terms. 1 for each woman he was convicted of murdering. But even that number, prosecutors and investigators believe, may be far from the truth. He now lives out his days in solitary confinement at Washington State Penitentiary. There, the man who once haunted an entire region is nothing more than an aging prisoner with nothing left but time and memory. And still, the story isn't finished. There are families who have not yet found their daughters. There are bodies still missing, bones still buried, identities still unknown. For every name Gary Ridgway confessed, there may be others he never revealed. The full scope of his crimes may never be known, but one thing is certain. The quiet man in the SeaTac house, the church-going truck painter, the polite husband, that man was a mask. Behind it lived a predator whose crimes reshaped how we understand evil and how we search for it. Following his arrest and overwhelming evidence against him, Gary Ridgway eventually agreed to cooperate with authorities. As part of his plea deal to avoid the death penalty, he offered to assist investigators in locating the remains of his undiscovered victims. The plea hearing that followed was surreal, almost grotesquely quiet. In the courtroom, the same man who had strangled dozens of women to death, who had revisited their decaying bodies in the woods, sat calmly and confessed without emotion. He spoke in a low, steady voice, offering details with the kind of dispassionate detachment you might expect from someone describing a mundane routine, not from someone recounting decades of murder. He didn't cry, he didn't apologize, he didn't hesitate. His confessions revealed the full scope of his monstrosity. He referred to the women he killed, not as people, not as daughters or mothers, but as my property. To him, they were objects, tools to be used and discarded. In those statements, there was no remorse, no guilt, only a twisted sense of ownership and a chilling void where empathy should have been. Gary Ridgway told investigators that killing sex workers had become, in his words, a career. He believed that no one would come looking for them. In his mind, society had already written them off. He exploited that, methodically selecting victims who were marginalized young runaways, drug addicts, the homeless people without a strong safety net, people who wouldn't be missed quickly, if at all. When asked why he had killed so many women, Gary gave a variety of conflicting reasons, none of which truly explained his motives. He blamed his overbearing mother, his failed marriages, his feelings of rejection and inadequacy. even his religious upbringing. But those who heard him speak sensed that these explanations were little more than excuse attempts to manipulate perception, to shift blame, to sound more like a man driven by pain rather than one consumed by cruelty. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Gary Ridgway murdered because it gave him pleasure. It gave him a sense of power, of absolute control over another person's fate. The thrill of deciding whether someone lived or died was intoxicating to him. He enjoyed the act of killing, the planning, the disposal, and the secrecy. It wasn't rage or desperation that drove him, it was gratification. In 2003, Gary Ridgway was officially sentenced to 48 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. Each sentence represented one of the women he had admitted to killing, though the actual number of his victims remained uncertain. Over the years, as more bodies were discovered and more evidence came to light, his confirmed victim count grew to 49. Yet Gary himself admitted the true number was likely much higher. Perhaps 70, perhaps 80, he claimed he'd lost count. The precise toll may never be known. Some women remain missing to this day, their disappearances lost in the vast shadow of Ridgway's crimes. What made Ridgway's case so disturbing was not just the scale of his violence, the contrast between the horror he inflicted and the utter normalcy of his public life. To the world around him, Gary was nothing more than an unremarkable man. His co-workers at the truck factory described him as punctual, soft-spoken, and consistent. His neighbors knew him as the guy who waved hello from his lawn, who walked his dog and helped with community watch. Even his wives never suspected a thing. Judith Mosen, his third wife, later said she never once felt unsafe around him. He made her laugh. He cooked dinner. He went to church. He came home on time. That's what makes Ridgway so chilling. He proved that monsters don't need fangs or blood-stained clothes. They don't always skulk in alleys or leer from behind bars. Sometimes, they smile at you in the checkout line. Sometimes, they go unnoticed for decades, hiding behind the plainest of masks. His victims, those lost to the Green River Killer, were among the most vulnerable people in society. Many were teenagers who had aged out of foster care with no family to fall back on. Some were escaping abuse. Others were battling addiction or mental illness. Many turned to sex work as a last resort, seeking survival in a world that seemed to offer them nothing else. They weren't just statistics or headlines. They were sisters, daughters, and mothers. Each of them had a name, a face, a story. Each of them deserved far more than the brutal fate Gary Ridgway gave them. For their families, Ridgway's capture brought a mix of relief and pain. After years, sometimes decades of not knowing what happened to their loved ones, they finally had answers. But those answers came with unbearable truths. They had to learn how their daughters were strangled, violated, and left to decay alone in the woods. They had to live with the knowledge that someone had treated them as disposable. Today, Gary Ridgway remains incarcerated in Washington State Penitentiary. At 75 years old, he is a frail version of the man who once terrorized the Pacific Northwest. He will die in prison. Occasionally, he offers to help authorities locate more bodies, always in exchange for something better: food, more phone time, attention. Even behind bars, he craves control. He wants to be needed. The case of the Green River Killer reshaped how law enforcement handles serial murder investigations. It underscored the critical importance of DNA evidence. It highlighted the need for multi-agency collaboration. But more importantly, it exposed a deep failure in how society values certain lives over others. The victims of Gary Ridgway were ignored because they were poor, addicted, or involved in sex work. They were seen as threats, and because of that perception, Ridgway was able to kill again and again and again. He exploited that indifference. He counted on it. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of the Green River case is this: evil does not always announce itself with menace. Sometimes, it looks like the man next door. Sometimes, it wears a smile. And sometimes, it walks among us unnoticed, carrying out unspeakable acts while no one is watching. The Green River itself, once a quiet waterway outside Seattle, became a symbol of horror. For nearly 2 decades, it bore witness to Ridgway's legacy. Its banks were littered with remains, its name forever etched into the history of American crime, and the man who caused it all, the man whose hands ended nearly 50 lives, looked no different from any other factory worker or suburban husband. That may be the most terrifying truth of all. But this story of darkness does not end with Gary Ridgway. As his reign of terror faded into history, another nightmare was taking shape, this time beneath the blazing sun of Northern California. In the dry farmlands of Yuba City, where the earth cracks beneath endless rows of crops and the scent of peaches hangs thick in the air, another predator was hiding in plain sight. It was a place where migrant workers arrived each spring, seeking honest labor and a better life. People willing to toil from sunrise to sunset in fields that gave no rest. Among them, however, walked a man who would bring death instead of opportunity. His name was Juan Vallejo, born on February 7, 1934, in the small town of Otlan, Jalisco, Mexico. Juan's early life was shaped by poverty, like countless others. He dreamed of crossing the border into the United States, the land of promise, where a better life seemed possible. In 1950, at the age of 16, he followed his siblings north and slipped into California illegally, hoping to find the kind of work that could lift his family from hardship. For years, Juan blended into the background of America's agricultural workforce. He picked fruit, hoed fields, and harvested vegetables, working silently in the shadows of the nation's food industry. He was one of many, the invisible backbone of American farming, a face among thousands. Unseen, unremarkable, but somewhere along the way, something inside him changed. As the spring of 1971 arrived in Yuba City, life seemed, at first, routine. The orchards bloomed with promise. The fields awaited laborers, migrant workers, Mexican, Salvadoran, Guatemalan poured into the valley. They were men without papers, without homes, without voices, and they would become the perfect victims. Over the following months, one by one, 25 men would vanish from the farms around Yuba City. They were never reported missing. No one asked where they went, and no one knew that a monster had made their babies disappear beneath the very soil they worked to harvest. But that story, Juan Corona's story, was only beginning. Family members and acquaintances of Juan Vallejo Corona often described him as a deeply troubled man, haunted by a traumatic event that seemed to mark the beginning of his psychological unraveling. In 1955, the Sacramento Valley was struck by a catastrophic flood, one of the deadliest in the region's history, which claimed the lives of 37 people in Yuba City alone. This disaster was not just an external event to Juan. It became a turning point that would profoundly alter his perception of reality. According to his brother, Natividad, Juan came to believe that everyone in the area had drowned in the flood. In a 1956 petition to have Juan institutionalized, Natividad wrote that the flood had triggered a psychotic break in his brother's mind. The natural disaster was no longer merely an event, but had transformed into a terrifying revelation. Juan thought that the living were actually dead, that the world around him was populated by ghosts and spirits of the drowned. This disturbing belief system led to a serious psychiatric intervention. In January 1956, after what was described as a schizophrenic episode, Juan was committed to the DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California. There he was diagnosed with a schizophrenic reaction of the paranoid type, a severe mental disorder marked by delusions and distorted perceptions of reality. During his time in the hospital, Juan underwent 23 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy, a treatment often used at the time for severe mental illness, but one that frequently lacked the rigorous follow-up care required for true recovery. After 3 months of treatment, the hospital declared Juan recovered, and he was released. But like many patients of that era, his release was marked more by institutional procedures than by true rehabilitation. He was medicated briefly, stunned by the brutal treatments, and then sent back out into the world with minimal support or understanding of his deep-seated issues. Upon release, he was deported back to Mexico, removed from the country he had once tried to make his home. Yet Juan's story didn't end there. In 1962, after years away, Juan was granted a green card and legally returned to the United States. Now back on American soil, he was perceived as a hardworking man struggling with schizophrenia and a volatile temper. Despite his mental health challenges, Juan secured employment and began to rebuild his life. But the shadows of his past were never far away. It was during this second chapter of his life that Juan took on a new role, one that would grant him a degree of authority he had never known before. He became a licensed labor contractor, responsible for hiring and managing crews of field workers on fruit ranches. This position gave him unprecedented power over the lives of dozens of men, many of them Mexican immigrants like himself who depended on his decisions for their livelihood. The men Juan hired were often marginalized members of society. They were transients and drifters, older men with histories of alcoholism or instability, men with few or no family connections nearby. Because of their social invisibility and precarious existence, their disappearances might go unnoticed for weeks, even months. This tragic reality made them ideal targets for a predator who needed victims who could vanish without immediate scrutiny. As Juan settled into the community, his public persona was that of a respectable family man. He married, had children, attended church regularly, and operated what appeared to be a successful business. To neighbors and colleagues, he was the epitome of the American immigrant. Success, story quiet, dependable, and hardworking. No one suspected the horrors that lurked beneath his calm exterior. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, Juan's darker impulses began to resurface and grow stronger. In March 1970, he was admitted once more to DeWitt State Hospital for treatment, signaling that his mental health was again deteriorating. The following year, in March 1971, Juan applied for welfare but was denied. Pressure mounted on multiple fronts, and whatever psychological barriers had kept his violent tendencies in check began to crumble. The first tangible sign that something terrible was unfolding came on May 19, 1971. A local farm owner who had contracted Juan to supply workers noticed something deeply unsettling: a freshly filled hole in his peach orchard. The hole measured approximately 4 feet deep, 5 feet long, and 2 feet wide, the perfect size and shape for a shallow grave. The farm owner, Goro Kagahiro, was disturbed by the sight. He had no idea then that this hole would mark the beginning of one of the most horrifying discoveries in California's history. He promptly reported the find to the sheriff's office. Underneath the soil was the body of Kenneth Whitaker, a laborer who had vanished weeks before. What followed over the next few weeks was nothing short of a nightmare coming to life. More bodies were uncovered, buried in shallow graves scattered across orchards and fields. 6 days after the first discovery, a second body was found on a nearby ranch. Soon, a third body surfaced close to the Feathered River. Near this third grave, a deputy found 2 receipts from a local meat market bearing the name Juan Vallejo Corona, a damning piece of evidence that would link the killer to the scene. The investigation that followed became one of the most intensive and grisly excavations in the annals of American criminal history. By the time the search ended on June 4th, authorities had uncovered a total of 25 bodies. To put this number in context, it was twice the number of victims attributed to the infamous Boston Strangler, the most prolific serial killer known in the United States at that time. The crime scenes told a brutal and methodical story. Juan Corona's preferred method of killing was stabbing repeatedly and viciously. All but one victim died by multiple stab wounds to the chest. The exception was shot to death, but this was rare in his pattern. The way Juan buried his victims was equally chilling. Each man was placed face up in the shallow grave, with his arms raised above his head and his shirt pulled over his face, as if to silence him. In some cases, their pants were pulled down to their ankles, a desecration that added a humiliating layer to the horror. But the savagery of the murders extended beyond stabbing and burial rituals. Investigators found that many of Juan's victims had suffered horrific facial mutilations. Their heads appeared to have been hacked at with a machete or a large knife, leaving gruesome wounds that suggested extreme rage or a ritualistic pattern. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Juan had carved a cross onto the back of each victim's skull. This macabre signature raised chilling questions about his mindset and motivations. Was it an act of religious symbolism, a mark of ownership, or something darker? A twisted ritual that accompanied the murders. The sexual element of the crimes added yet another layer of depravity. Before their deaths, many victims had been sodomized, indicating that the killings had a strong sexual component. This pointed toward a man driven not only by rage or psychosis, but by a deeply rooted sexual sadism. Juan Corona appeared to follow a gruesome routine. He would select a victim, dig a shallow grave, sexually assault the man, then stab him to death and bury him in the freshly dug hole. This chilling pattern underscored the cold, calculated nature of his crimes, as well as the extent of his cruelty. As officers continued to excavate the area, uncovering more victims and evidence, the scope of Juan's terror became clearer. At least 6 additional bodies were unearthed beyond the initial 25, confirming that the true death toll could be even higher. These revelations sent shockwaves through the small agricultural communities, where the victims had quietly lived and worked without drawing attention. In the end, the story of Juan Vallejo Corona became a dark chapter in American criminal history that revealed how vulnerable populations could be preyed upon, and how a seemingly ordinary man could harbor an unimaginable capacity for violence. Juan Vallejo Corona was finally arrested on May 26, 1971, bringing an end to a terrifying chapter of violence that had haunted the agricultural communities of Northern California. The evidence amassed against him was overwhelming and left little room for doubt about his guilt. Among the items seized from his possession were 2 blood-stained knives, a machete, a pistol, and clothing soaked in the blood of his victims. Perhaps most damning was a meticulously kept work, Legera Chillin' Death List, which contained 34 names and dates, 7 of which matched the known victims discovered in shallow graves scattered across the orchards. Each of the men on this ledger had either been hired through Corona's labor contracting business, or had been seen in his company shortly before their disappearances. This ledger revealed the full extent of Corona's calculated and methodical planning. He had leveraged his position of authority within the community to isolate and select his victims, men who were often invisible to society at large. The trial that followed became a media spectacle, but one clouded by a troubling social reality. The victims were predominantly Mexican immigrant farm laborers, a group that the broader public and media regarded with indifference. Crime historian Peter Vronsky later noted that this societal attitude put a damper on any widespread interest the newspaper reading and TV watching public might have had. The lives of these men, marginalized and overlooked, seems to garner less attention and empathy than victims from more privileged communities. In 1973, Corona was convicted on 25 counts of first-degree murder, a staggering tally that at the time made him the deadliest known serial killer in American history. However, despite the magnitude of his crimes, his name would soon fade from public memory. More sensational killers with victims from communities society valued more highly eclipsed his story, pushing it to the margins of criminal lore. The conviction, however, was not the final word. In 1978, an appellate court overturned his conviction on grounds of incompetent legal representation and granted him a new trial. The retrial unearthed even darker facets of the Corona family's history. Around the same time as the murders, Juan's half-brother, Natividad Corona, mysteriously fled his home in Marysville, California, reportedly seeking refuge back in Mexico. Natividad had been the proprietor of a restaurant called the Guadalajara and was embroiled in a legal battle. He faced a $250,000 lawsuit filed by a former patron who alleged that Natividad had brutally attacked him with a machete in the cafe's room after the man rejected Natividad's unwanted sexual advances. Juan's defense team seized upon this narrative, suggesting that the real murderer of the farm workers might have been Natividad, who was openly homosexual and had a history of violent behavior, including the alleged machete attack at his restaurant. The defense argued that after losing the lawsuit, Natividad fled to Mexico evading justice. Despite these attempts to shift blame, the second trial in 1982 once again resulted in a conviction on all counts. The evidence was simply too strong, the pattern to clear, and the methodical brutality of the crimes to obviously the handiwork of one man. Over decades, Juan Corona's silence behind prison walls remained unbroken until when, at the age of 77 and suffering from dementia, he finally admitted to the killings during a parole hearing. As Sutter County Assistant District Attorney Jana McClung recalled, Corona confessed to a psychiatrist in July of that year, stating he had killed the transient farm laborers because they were trespassing on land, yet even this confession raised more questions than it answered. Corona's testimony included details about two victims whose descriptions did not match any of the 25 bodies uncovered by Sutter County Sheriff's detectives during the grim excavations in 1971. He described using a kitchen knife to kill his first victim, admitting he cut himself during the act, a haunting glimpse into the violent nature of his crimes. Juan Vallejo Corona passed away on March 4, 2019, at the age of 85, in a hospital near Corcoran State Prison. 14 of his 25 victims, including 4 unidentified men, were laid to rest in a common grave near the community of Sutter, just west of Yuba City. An inscription on the grave marker poignantly reads, "Here lie 14 men of the sad, 4 of them known only to God." The case of Juan Vallejo Corona exposes deeply unsettling truths about society's valuation of human life. Despite the staggering number of victims, the media's interest waned quickly, reflecting a broader indifference to crimes against marginalized populations. Corona's killing spree arguably marked the beginning of what some crime historians call the golden age of serial murders in the United States. Peter Vronsky noted, "If there was a ground zero in the serial killer epidemic to come, then Juan Corona fits the bill. He was a killer who took more lives than infamous figures such as Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, or John Wayne Gacy in their respective sprees. Yet his name remains relatively unknown. His victims were men whose society had effectively written off living on the fringes, surviving day-to-day in agricultural valleys where their labor was valued, but their lives were often invisible. Juan Corona's story forces a harsh confrontation with uncomfortable realities about which victims matter, whose stories are told, and which killers are remembered. He understood that certain individuals could vanish without notice, that some lives were deemed disposable in the eyes of society. In the anonymity of California's agricultural valleys, where migrant workers labored in silence and Juan Corona found a hunting ground perfectly suited to his horrific needs. What makes Corona's crimes particularly terrifying is not only the high body count, but the way he ruthlessly exploited society's blind spots. Outwardly, He was a successful businessman, a family man, and a pillar of the immigrant community. But beneath this carefully crafted mask was a predator who knew precisely which lives could be erased without consequence. The legacy of the Corona case is a stark reminder of how social invisibility can become a shield for the most heinous of crimes. It forces us to reckon with the painful truth that justice and remembrance are often influenced by prejudice and indifference, and that true horror sometimes lurks behind the most ordinary facade. What Juan Corona's case ultimately teaches us is that evil rarely makes a grand entrance, announcing itself with fanfare or obvious menace. Instead, it often wears a guise of normalcy and respectability, functioning quietly within the very structures of legitimate authority and preying upon those society has already pushed to the margins and forgotten. Juan Corona didn't merely take the lives of 25 men. He laid bare a brutal truth: that some lives are valued more highly than others, and that monsters frequently conceal themselves behind the most ordinary faces. Shielded by the blind spots created by societal prejudice and indifference, his victims were killed twice, first by his violent hands, and second by the collective apathy that allowed their disappearances to go unnoticed for so long. This painful double tragedy might be the most haunting aspect of all. Meanwhile, far from the agricultural fields of Northern California, in the quiet streets of Santa Cruz, California, where the towering redwoods stretch their shadows long over sleepy neighborhoods, and the Pacific breeze carries the scent of salt and calm, a new darkness was stirring. It was 1972, a time when the nation's attention was absorbed by the escalating Vietnam War and the sweeping cultural revolutions redefining America's identity. Yet beneath this backdrop of social upheaval and change, a young man was quietly descending into a nightmare from which many would never awaken. His name was Herbert William Mullen. If you have never heard of him, that is no accident. His story defies the narratives we are comfortable digesting. Unlike many notorious killers born into trauma, poverty, or obvious dysfunction, Herbert's early life seemed, on the surface, to be the very picture of the American dream. Herbert was born on April 18, 1947, in California, a date he would later infuse with dark meaning, as it was the anniversary of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that devastated the region and claimed thousands of lives. For Herbert, this was no coincidence, but a scene of destiny he believed was preordained. Raised in a middle-class household, Herbert's father, Martin Bill Mullen, was a decorated World War II veteran, respected and stern, but not abusive. He taught his son how to handle firearms and shared tales of his military exploits. Herbert's mother was a devoted homemaker, and he had an older sister. The family moved from their rural farming routes to the bustling city of San Francisco when Herbert was 5, and later settled in the scenic town of Felton in Santa Cruz County. In school, Herbert was exactly the kind of young man parents hoped their children would become: popular, athletic, and academically capable. He played varsity football, had a wide circle of friends, and maintained a steady relationship with his girlfriend. Teachers described him as bright and gentle-natured, while classmates voted him most likely to succeed. After graduating high school in 1965, Herbert enrolled at Cabrillo College, pursuing engineering, and even entertained the idea of joining the military like his father. But the promising trajectory of his life took a sharp and devastating turn shortly thereafter. The summer after graduation, Herbert's best friend, Dean Richardson, died tragically in a car accident. The loss shattered something fundamental inside Herbert's psyche. Instead of processing his grief in healthy ways, he became obsessed with death and the possibility of reincarnation. In his bedroom, he constructed shrines dedicated to Dean, spending hours alone in silent communion with what he believed was his friend's lingering spirit. This marked the beginning of Herbert's slow but relentless descent into madness. The early signs were subtle but alarming. Herbert began experimenting with drugs, first marijuana, then LSD and other hallucinogens. The late 1960s Santa Cruz was a hotbed of countercultural experimentation, where drugs, alternative, spirituality, and psychedelic exploration flourished. Herbert immersed himself fully in this world, adopting the hippie lifestyle that horrified his conservative, military father. He explored yoga, meditation, macrobiotic diets, and even attempted to join a priesthood. But beneath these surface pursuits, his mind was fracturing. Paranoia crept in. His moods grew unpredictable, and his behavior increasingly erratic. In 1968, Herbert confided to his girlfriend that he believed he might be gay, effectively ending their relationship. This confession, along with his shifting mental state, marked a turning point. Over the next several years, Herbert drifted through various mental institutions, but never stayed long enough to receive proper or consistent treatment. His family, desperate for answers, attributed his strange behavior primarily to drug use. Come on. Enough in that era, and region, but the truth was far darker. Herbert was not simply a troubled young man experimenting with drugs. He was developing paranoid schizophrenia, a severe and debilitating mental illness that distorted his perceptions of reality and unraveled his grip on sanity. Between October 1972 and February 1973, Herbert Mullen's fractured mind gave birth to a horrific killing spree that would claim 13 innocent lives. His victims were wildly diverse children, elderly people, even a priest with ages ranging from as young as 4 to as old as 7. They had nothing in common except for the cruel misfortune of crossing paths with a killer who genuinely believed that their deaths would spare California from devastating earthquakes. Herbert's warped ideology was deeply tied to the seismic history of the state. He saw himself as an agent of fate, a grim reaper who could prevent cataclysm by offering these human sacrifices. The link between his birth date and the catastrophic San Francisco earthquake of 1906 was, in his mind, no accident. It was a calling he felt compelled to fulfill. As the months passed and the body count grew, Herbert moved with a chilling, methodical precision, even as his behavior grew more disconnected from reality. His actions shocked and baffled investigators who struggled to comprehend how someone so outwardly ordinary could commit such brutal acts. Throughout this dark chapter, the townspeople of Santa Cruz remained unaware of the nightmare unfolding in their midst. Herbert Mullen, once the golden boy of his high school class, was now a figure of terror, his violence fueled by a deeply fractured mind and an unfathomable belief in his own divine mission. Herbert Mullen's grip on reality began to unravel completely, swallowed by the dark storm of his own fractured mind. The voices he heard were no longer mere whispers or fleeting illusions. They had transformed into persistent, commanding presences that controlled his every thought and action. These auditory hallucinations were not figments of imagination or fragments of conscience. To Herbert, they were as tangible and insistent as any real conversation. The dominant voice among them was the disembodied, omnipotent version of his father, not the man he had known in life, but an ethereal, authoritative entity, communicating with him telepathically. This spectral paternal figure issued commands that Herbert felt utterly powerless to resist, a compulsion he obeyed without question. By 1972, at the age of 25, Herbert had returned to live with his parents in their Felton home. It was during this period that his obsession with earthquakes intensified. He immersed himself in the study of seismic patterns, developing an elaborate delusional system that wove the natural world, political events, and his own destiny into a single catastrophic tapestry. In his warped perception, the Vietnam War had produced sufficient American casualties to act as sacrificial offerings, appeasing the Earth's destructive forces and preventing devastating earthquakes from ravaging California. Yet as the war wound down and American deaths decreased, Herbert became convinced that this delicate cosmic balance was breaking. Without enough blood spilled in war, the Earth's fury would be unleashed, obliterating entire cities and communities. In this fractured worldview, Herbert saw himself as a divine instrument chosen, as the leader of his generation, and charged with maintaining equilibrium through acts of human sacrifice. The date of his birth? April 18th, the anniversary of the catastrophic 1906 San Francisco earthquake, was not a coincidence, but a symbol of his sacred mission. The voices in his head, particularly that of his telepathic father, escalated their demands, commanding him to kill. On October 13, 1972, Herbert Mullen committed his first known murder. Driving his 1958 Chevrolet station wagon to a remote location, he feigned car trouble by popping the hood, deliberately creating a scenario designed to attract help. A 55-year-old homeless man named Lawrence Whitey White stopped to offer assistance, agreeing to fix the car in exchange for a ride. But Herbert's gratitude quickly turned to White repeatedly with a baseball bat until the man's life was extinguished. Later, Herbert rationalized this gruesome act by claiming that White resembled the biblical prophet Jonah, whom he believed had sent him telepathic messages. "Hey man, pick me up and throw me overboard. Kill me, so that others will be saved." With this twisted justification, Herbert dragged the lifeless body into the woods, where it was discovered by passers-by the next day. This first killing gave Herbert a perverse sense of validation. He had obeyed the voices, fulfilling what he believed was a higher purpose. Yet one death would never satisfy the relentless demands echoing in his mind. The voices insisted on more sacrifices. Just 11 days later, on October 24th, Herbert encountered Mary Margaret Gill, a young student at Cabrillo College who was running late for an appointment. When Herbert offered her a ride, she accepted, unaware she was stepping into the path of a killer. While driving, Herbert suddenly plunged a knife into her chest, ending her life instantly. But this murder was different from the first. Driven by delusions about environmental toxins, Herbert believed he needed to examine Mary's organs for evidence of pollution. After killing her, he disemboweled her corpse, hanging her intestines from tree branches like grotesque, macabre decorations. Mary's body was not found for several months. When it was eventually discovered, law enforcement initially suspected the involvement of Edmund Kemper, another serial killer terrorizing the Santa Cruz area at the same time. The coincidence of two active killers in the same small city would confound investigators for months, complicating the case significantly. 4 days after Mary's murder, on November 2nd, All Souls Day, Herbert's twisted mind took him to St. Mary's Catholic Church in Los Gatos. He entered the confessional booth and began confessing his crimes to Father Enrique, the 64-year-old priest who unwittingly became Herbert's next victim. In Herbert's distorted reality, Father Tom volunteered to become a sacrifice, offering himself to save others from impending disaster. But instead of absolution, Herbert delivered death, stabbing the priest inside the sacred confessional, a place intended for redemption and forgiveness, transformed into a chamber of horror. The killing spree continued into early 1973. In January, Herbert attempted to enlist in the United States Marine Corps, perhaps hoping that military service might provide a legitimate outlet for his violent urges. He passed both physical and psychiatric evaluations, but when recruiters uncovered his extensive criminal record and erratic behavior, they rejected him outright. Herbert interpreted this rejection as evidence of a vast conspiracy aimed at destroying him, further feeding the paranoia that dominated his thoughts. By this time, Herbert had ceased all drug use, attributing his deteriorating condition to his past substance abuse. He fixated his blame on Jim Gianna, a former high school friend who had first introduced him to marijuana. Convinced that Gianna had ruined his life, Herbert tracked him down to a remote cabin nestled in the Santa Cruz Mountains. When Herbert confronted Gianna, he found his old friend defenseless, and, unsatisfied by any explanation or apology, shot him dead. But Herbert's spree was far from over. The voices commanding him demanded more blood, and his murders soon escalated into a frenzy of violence that reached its most horrifying peak on February 10, 1973. On that day, Herbert traveled to a secluded cabin where another acquaintance, Kathy Francis, was staying, but the cabin was not empty. Inside were Kathy and the entire Giannara family, James and Joan Giannara, along with their two young children, 4-year-old Damon and 9-year-old Damon. In a brutal outburst, Herbert executed all 5 occupants of the cabin, leaving no survivors. The senseless slaughter of the 2 innocent children, who had done nothing to deserve such a fate, underscored the terrifying depth of Herbert's madness and the merciless nature of his killing spree. Herbert Mullen's reign of terror came to an abrupt and dramatic end on February 13, 1973. Just 3 days after the grisly massacre at the remote cabin. Driving through the quiet streets of Santa Cruz, Herbert's eyes caught sight of a teenage boy casually walking alone along the sidewalk. In a sudden, unprovoked impulse, Herbert raised his weapon and fired a shot, wounding the young boy but not ending his life. Passers-by who witnessed the shooting immediately called the police, and within minutes officers arrived at the scene. What they found was unsettling in its calmness. Herbert sat quietly in his car, showing none of the panic or remorse one might expect from a man who had just pulled the trigger. His demeanor was eerily composed, almost detached, as if the weight of what he had done failed to register with him fully. Upon arrest, Herbert did not resist or deny the accusations. Instead, he spoke openly about his killings with a chilling, matter-of-fact tone, as if describing routine work rather than the taking of 13 human lives. He told investigators that he had murdered 13 individuals with the purpose of preventing catastrophic earthquakes that he believed would otherwise devastate California. To Herbert, his victims were not people but necessary sacrifices, human offerings demanded by the voices that spoke inside his head, especially the commanding presence of his father's telepathic voice. He framed his horrific acts as obedience to divine orders, carrying out a mission to save the greater good at any cost. The ensuing trial became a spectacle of psychiatric evaluations and legal arguments, a tumultuous battle between the notions of mental illness and criminal responsibility. Herbert's defense team sought to prove that he was legally insane at the time of the murders. They argued that his paranoid schizophrenia robbed him of the capacity to understand right from wrong, and brought in expert psychiatrists who painted a harrowing picture of a man utterly disconnected from reality, trapped in a labyrinth of delusions and voices. Yet the prosecution countered with a different narrative. They argued that despite his illness, Herbert knew the nature of his actions and recognized their wrongfulness. They pointed to his deliberate efforts to conceal evidence and the calculated manner in which he selected his victims. Far from a man overcome by uncontrollable madness, they portrayed him as a dangerous predator, exploiting mental illness as a shield to escape full accountability. Throughout the trial, Herbert's behavior remained erratic and disturbing. At times, he would sit motionless, eyes glazed as if listening to inaudible voices only he could hear. At other moments, he would launch into strange declarations about cosmic conspiracies and his supposed role as a chosen savior of mankind. He described himself with bizarre multiplicities, claiming to be bisexual, bipolitical, bicultural, bispiritual, and even falsely asserting that he was biracial. Ultimately, the jury found Herbert guilty of 10 counts of murder, rejecting his insanity plea. They determined that, although he suffered from mental illness, he had sufficient understanding of the criminality of his actions. Herbert was sentenced to life imprisonment, avoiding the death penalty, a sentence many believed was too lenient given the brutality of his crimes. Behind prison walls, Herbert continued to live within the confines of his delusions. He remained steadfast in his belief that his murders had successfully prevented earthquakes and saved California from destruction. Throughout his incarceration, he showed no remorse for the lives he had taken, viewing them as noble sacrifices made for the preservation of a greater cosmic balance. Diagnosed with schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type, he spent his remaining years shuttled between various psychiatric facilities embedded within the prison system. In a cruel twist of fate, Herbert shared a cell block with Edmund Kemper, another infamous serial killer who had terrorized the Santa Cruz area during the same time period. Kemper, a towering man standing 6 feet 9 inches tall and responsible for the deaths of 8 people, found Herbert both annoying and pitiable. He described Mullen as a man riddled with internal torment, anguish, and hatred, directed even at strangers unknown to him. Kemper employed behavioral modification techniques to manage Herbert, throwing cold water on him when he misbehaved and rewarding silence with peanuts. The dynamic between these two notorious killers was a disturbing footnote to an already grim chapter in California's criminal history. Despite nearly 5 decades behind bars, Herbert Mullen was denied parole 8 separate times. Even in his final parole hearing in 2021, he remained unrepentant, continuing to shift blame onto others rather than expressing genuine remorse for the 30 lives he had extinguished. The district attorney overseeing his case noted with disappointment, Herbert had never demonstrated true contrition for his brutal murders and persisted in blaming external forces for his actions. On August 18, 2022, exactly 75 years after his birth, coinciding once again with the anniversary of the devastating 1906 San Francisco earthquake, Herbert Mullen passed away of natural causes. He died incarcerated at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, bringing it close to one of the most tragic and bizarre criminal cases in the state's history. Herbert Mullen's story challenges our deepest assumptions about the nature of evil and the impact of mental illness. Here was a man who seemed destined for a promising future, raised in a loving family, and endowed with every advantage. Yet somewhere in the depths of his mind, whether through genetic predisposition, environmental triggers, or the cruel randomness of biology, he was transformed into a monster. His 13 victims did not die because of any personal failing or misstep, but simply because they existed at the wrong place and the wrong time. They crossed paths with a deeply disturbed individual whose fractured perception convinced him their deaths were a necessary act to save the world. Herbert Mullen stands as a haunting example of how evil does not always announce itself with dramatic, unmistakable signs. Sometimes it grows silently and invisibly in the mind of someone who outwardly appears normal, nurtured by the voices that sound as real as any human conversation. His case is a chilling reminder that the boundary between sanity and madness, between ordinary citizen and deadly predator, is thinner and more fragile than society cares to admit. Ultimately, Herbert Mullen did not save California from earthquakes. Instead, he contributed to the sum total of human suffering, leaving behind grieving families and a community forever marked by his horrific acts. Though his name may never be as widely known as some of the more sensational serial killers, the devastation he wrought was no less profound for those whose lives he destroyed. His legacy serves as a stark warning of the dangers posed by untreated mental illness. When combined with a perfect storm of personal and societal circumstances, it reminds us how a promising young life can spiral into darkness, and how the most dangerous predators sometimes wear the most ordinary masks.